Chapter 374. Jingjiu looked at her in silence. The little princess looked at him in silence. The two of them stared at each other's eyes, neither of them speaking. After a long while, the little princess fell forward into Jingjiu's bosom, probably because her knees were sore. She couldn't support herself with her hands. An argument suddenly broke out in the grand hall. It was unclear what the two emperors were arguing about. The little princess summoned up her courage and kissed Jingjiu on his cheek. Then, she bounced back and sat down as if she was scalded. She giggled twice at Jingjiu. Jingjiu didn't have the sword fire, so he had no choice but to wipe off the saliva on his face with his sleeve. "What if you mistook me for someone else?" he asked. The little princess was startled. She asked shyly while covering her face with her small hands, Do you know who I am?" Jingjiu said, "Like I said, I'll recognize you if I meet you." The little princess looked at Jingjiu adorably through the gaps between her fingers as she said, Could you pretend that you didn't recognize me?" The conversation between the Chu emperor and the Qin emperor came to an end. The door of the grand hall was opened, and the old maidservant and the palace servant girl walked in. The little princess felt as if she had been pardoned. She slid down the bed hastily and headed toward the outside of the grand hall while holding the Qin emperor's hand. Seeing the bouncing figure of the little girl and thinking of her demure and feeble appearance in the outside world, Jingjiu thought it was a good thing for her. He turned to look at the blue bird on the tree branch outside the window and said, "I don't want to be seen by anybody. I believe she doesn't want to see it either." The people outside the Huin Valley saw the scenes very quickly. No matter how high their cultivation states were, they could only see the general picture. What they could see depended entirely on the choice of the spirit of the green sky mirror, which was what the blue bird flying back and forth wanted to show them. The blue bird was Qing. She was quite familiar with Bai Zhao, and she had an indescribable closeness to Jingjiu. As such, she listened to Jingjiu and didn't show the scene of the two innocent lovers in the royal palace of the Chu kingdom. Hejan's tragic story fell into everyone's eyes. Although there was no specific scene of him being castrated, one could imagine the pain. Sensei clenched the dried fish tightly as she stared at the light screen in the sky and asked, "Who is that kid from the eastern village?" Shui Yununri shook her head and said, "He seems to be a rogue cultivator. Hejan should know him." Sensei took a bite of the dried fish and said, "I'm going to kill him." Shui Yununri was slightly shocked and persuaded. That's something that happened in the illusion realm. You can't bring it to the real world. Sensei forcefully chewed on the dried fish, her cheeks slightly puffed up as she hatefully said, "Can I kill him?" Shui Yununri replied, "Yes, these are the rules." The dried fish was very hard. Sensei had a hard time chewing it. She spat on the ground and said, "Then I'll kill him secretly." The Qin emperor stayed in the royal palace of the Chu kingdom for a few days. The little princess cried every day, asking to see the ninth prince. The old maidservants and the palace servant girls were puzzled, wondering why the little princess had suddenly become like this over the last few days since she was a little girl. The ninth prince of the Chu kingdom was indeed good-looking, but he was merely a bag of skin, extremely boring. Why did the little princess want to play with him? In fact, the little princess and Jingjiu didn't play games, nor did they play chess or tell stories. She didn't throw herself into Jingjiu's bosom because there were always people by her side, but she looked at him with a sweet smile. Sometimes, she would hold his hand and stroll in the royal garden of the royal palace, telling him in a soft voice that the royal palace in the north was full of killing intent, and there weren't so many flowers to see. Jingjiu let her do whatever she wanted, not because he spoiled her, but because he couldn't resist her, because she was physically weak. It was like a baby couldn't resist being fed milk, and a mortal couldn't resist death. There would be separation when they met, no matter if it was in the real world or in the illusionary realm. It was the day for the delegation of the Qin kingdom to return. The Chu emperor and the Qin emperor were talking while holding hands. Not far from them, the little princess of the Qin kingdom and the ninth prince of the Chu kingdom were talking while holding hands. Seeing this scene, the chancellors and populace of the two states couldn't help but laugh. "I'm afraid I won't remember you in the future," so I want to come and see you first." The little princess said earnestly while looking at the ninth prince's eyes, "We will be opponents from now on. Don't show me any mercy." "All right," said the ninth prince. In the days that followed, the old maidservants and palace servant girls in the royal palace liked to tease the ninth prince. "Do you miss her now that the little princess has left? Do you want to tell your father to take her as his wife?" But one day, the teasing suddenly stopped. The old maidservant patted the ninth prince's back gently, sighing and wiping the corners of her eyes once in a while. The ninth prince opened his eyes and looked at her in silence. He knew that the old maidservant would talk to him as long as he looked at her, no matter if it was here or outside. As expected, the old maidservant said after a while, "Poor your highness. Do you know how miserable the little princess who like you is now?" The delegation of the Qin kingdom suddenly disappeared after passing Sangzhou. It wasn't until the armies of the two states went to search for them that they found they had been ambushed. The corpses were everywhere in the mountains and fields. It was hard to tell who was who. They could only confirm that the Qin emperor had been killed by the royal robe and some other features, but they couldn't confirm whether the little princess was dead or not. It didn't take long before State Duke Pei, the younger brother of the Qin emperor, returned to Xianyang, the capital of the Qin kingdom, from the front line, confronting the northern barbarians with 20,000 cavalrymen. A bloody massacre took place in Xianyang that night. State Duke Pei ascended the throne the next day. On the day he ascended the throne, the new Qin emperor announced that his elder brother had been killed by a shameless sneak attack by Master Jing of Silla of the Chu kingdom. He demanded that the Chu kingdom hand over the murderer and cede more than half of its territory as compensation. The new Qin emperor's accusation didn't have any evidence. What had happened afterward indicated that he was the real murderer. He didn't send troops to the Chu kingdom for the rest of his life, but sent people to search for the whereabouts of the little princess. The people of the Qin kingdom were highly disciplined, but it didn't mean that they could accept any random order. In a few weeks, a dozen volunteer armies appeared in the territory of the Qin kingdom, attacking Xianyang under the banner of avenging the late emperor and helping the princess restore her kingdom. No matter what the real intention of those volunteer armies was, would they be able to find the little princess in time? Jingjiu didn't have much hope. She was too young. No matter how hard she cultivated, she couldn't be compared with an adult. It was difficult for other disciples of the Zhongzhou school to come to her side, and it would be difficult for her to live in this chaotic world. What Jingjiu didn't understand was that since she was the princess of the Qin kingdom, the crown prince Jing should be Tong Yin. But why didn't Tong Yin predict this and make arrangements in advance? Jingjiu didn't spend too much time thinking about this. He continued sleeping in the royal palace, which was to say, cultivating. Normally, he should have received the traditional education of a prince, such as the knowledge of books and the education of etiquette. As a prince, he had a lot of experience in muddling through these things easily. But he didn't want to waste his time on these things, so he ignored them all. As a result, his reputation as an idiot spread further and further. At the age of 10, the ninth prince faced the first test of his life. The emperor of the Chu kingdom died. One day, he missed his late wife very much. After getting drunk, he wanted to pick up the stars in the royal lake to make a necklace for his late wife. Unfortunately, he fell into the lake and caught a cold. The cold was severe, so the emperor passed away that night. This accident was weird no matter how one looked at it, but nobody paid any attention to it. Maybe it was because the emperor of Chu had seldom managed the state affairs in recent years, or maybe it was because the person who was going to be the emperor was an idiot. In the early morning of the next day, before dawn, the ninth prince was welcomed out of the grand hall by a few chancellors and carried to the main hall in a sedan, where he received the worship of the chancellors and heard the shouts of "Long live the emperor." Those chancellors obviously had their own thoughts, so he didn't want to pay any attention to them. Fortunately, those chancellors didn't want to pay any attention to him either. Soon, they sent him back to the back palace. However, he couldn't live in the old place anymore. He lived in the emperor's bedchamber. Yes, he was the emperor of the Chu kingdom now. An emperor was an emperor. Even if he was just a puppet emperor, many people would still be afraid of him. As such, some people would naturally listen to him. The first thing he did after he ascended to the throne was to ask the eunuchs to gather craftsmen and cut off the surface of the floor of the bedchamber with a small knife, turning it into a dense net. The house of peeled skin in the Yingjian Valley of the Cloud Dream Mountain had been made in this way, which left a good impression on him. This project wasn't very big and didn't cost too much money, but it was very troublesome, giving people a feeling of extravagance. The news spread out of the imperial palace very quickly. Driven by some people with ulterior motives, the situation took a certain direction. The new emperor had done such an unimaginable thing right after the death of the late emperor, which naturally aroused the resentment of many people. For a moment, drunkards were everywhere in the capital, denouncing the new emperor as an idiot. Of course, there were also many officials who submitted petitions to denounce the emperor. Those petitions entered the cabinet like snowflakes and were carefully folded. In the end, they were carried into the imperial palace by the royal tutor. The royal tutor severely criticized the emperor's absurd behavior and requested the emperor to study the ways of an emperor. He made it clear that he would go to the imperial palace every day to give lessons for the emperor from the second half of the month. Of course, the new emperor didn't pay any attention to the royal tutor, because he was neither an idiot nor an emperor. He was Jingjio. The peeling project for the entire palace stopped. In the next 2 days, 3 appointed chancellors and 2 royal uncles came to the imperial palace one after another. They either admonished the emperor with tears on their faces or instigated him with loyalty on their faces. Jingjio sat on the smooth floor, cultivating with his eyes closed, paying no attention to them. On the 3rd day, the person he was waiting to meet finally showed up. The grand scholar had an oval face with delicate eyes and brows, but he didn't have the usual femininity of the people of Chu Kingdom. He had a long beard that reached his abdomen, looking majestic even when he wasn't angry, and the expression in his eyes was calm and serene. He was so famous that even Jingjio knew him. If the army of Chu Kingdom was under the command of Jing of Silla, then the imperial court was under the control of this grand scholar. During the 10 years when the late emperor was indulging in wine and pleasure, the grand scholar had defeated 3 grand secretaries, and he was the leader of the so-called 5 appointed chancellors. Both in the officialdom and among the people, the grand scholar had a high opinion of the grand scholar. Even the eunuchs and old maidservants in the imperial palace were in awe of him, even more so than the late emperor. They only dared to call him the Grand Scholar. The Grand Scholar was indeed different from the other appointed chancellors. He didn't reminisce about his relationship with the late emperor in front of the new emperor, nor did he lecture him openly, nor did he nag him in secret. All he did was drink a cup of tea quietly, and then said, "As far as this official knows, those people didn't drink tea when they entered the imperial palace. This is the first cup of tea your majesty bestowed upon them." He put down the teacup and continued, "Your majesty is not an idiot who doesn't know the proper etiquette. Why did you do these things?" This was the first sentence Jingjio said after he ascended to the throne. "What do you think of it then?" After a moment of silence, the grand scholar said, "Many people in the imperial court have bad intentions, and the people are getting restless. Lord Jing of Silla is far away in Sangzhou, so no one knows what he is thinking. The reason why the situation is like this is because your majesty is too weak and incompetent. If the turmoil starts and the wars break out, the soldiers of the 3 armies will be bathed in blood, and the populace will be destitute and destitute. Can your majesty bear it? If you have been pretending to be weak, this official would like to ask your majesty to be strong from now on." Jingjio said, "I have been in the imperial palace for 10 years. Have you ever heard that I was playful and mischievous?" The grand scholar said, "Never. That's why this official has been curious." Jingjio asked, "Did you kill the late emperor?" This question was like a thunderbolt. If it were someone else, he would have been knocked unconscious by the shock. Yet, the grand scholar replied calmly, "No." Jingjio asked, "What is your family name?" The grand scholar lifted his head to take a look and was surprised to find that the emperor was not pretending. "The Zhang family of Jinling," he said angrily. Jingjio said, "That's a good family name. I'll have to trouble you from now on. I don't want to go to the court. Don't bother me if there is nothing important, and don't come if there is something important." Crown Prince Jing had his own team when he was 10 years old. It had something to do with his innate wisdom, and it was also because he had won his father's trust. He was lucky enough to find 3 participants of the Dao competition, and one of them was Xiang Wanshu. In the last few days, Jing Jiu had been paying close attention to the situation in the capital. The late emperor had died of illness. He was curious about how the young emperor would deal with the current situation and how he would face his career as an emperor. In the following days, the news came one after another. The new emperor started to build buildings on a large scale on the first day of his ascension to the throne, which caused a great deal of discontent among the populace and the imperial court. A few chancellors and members of the royal family entered the palace one after another. One day, the Grand Secretary Zhang entered the palace and had a long talk with the new emperor. Later, the construction that had stopped not long ago started again. The sounds of cutting the wooden sheets could be heard incessantly in the royal palace. It seemed that the Grand Hall would become the house of peeled skin in the Yingjian Valley. Crown Prince Jing thought about it for a long time, but he still couldn't figure out what the new emperor intended to do. Soon after, a shocking piece of news arrived. The royal teacher was dead. A strong wind rose in the capital. The imperial censors criticized each other, and the grand scholar remained silent. Many officials were stripped of their official positions, and some were even sent to prison. After the wind and rain, the sky cleared up. The people took a closer look and found that the officials who were still standing in the imperial court were mostly on the side of the grand scholar. Crown Prince Jing furrowed his thick eyebrows, feeling it more and more strange. Was this the strategy of using the tiger to drive the wolf away? But what if the ferocious tiger obtained a breather and turned around to eat you in one bite? The grand scholar was the regent. Did he really not want the throne anymore? It was not a problem to be indifferent to fame and fortune, and being so lazy was exactly like his temperament. However, without the protection of the imperial court and the identity of the emperor, how could he survive in this chaotic world? Here, he was not Jing Jiu. Or was it that his idea was different from mine? What was he going to do then? This question consumed a great deal of Crown Prince Jing's energy, so much so that the spot between his eyebrows felt a little hot. He picked up the bamboo stick and pushed open the window, letting the fresh air into the room. Only then did he feel a little better. The breeze blew on his face, making him feel especially cold. Looking at the snow mountain in the west outside the window, he suddenly felt a little absent-minded, but soon came back to his senses. With a vigilant expression on his face, he opened the secret compartment and took out a book. The handwriting on the book was a bit strange. It was a special handwriting he had created himself. Even the blue bird couldn't understand it, let alone his father and teacher. Chapter 375. The Crown Prince Jing was Tong Yin. He was a master of chess playing and good at scheming and calculating. It was because of him that Zhao Liu and Lu Shui were able to kill Lo Huainan across the state. He had only lost once in this aspect in his life, and that was when he was defeated by Jing Jiu in the chess tournament of the Plum Meeting. As such, he didn't care about the world or the other 23 participants of the Dao competition. He only cared about Jing Jiu. He had also recorded this statement in that book. Of course, there were many other contents in the book, such as the truth of this world and the purpose of his coming here, to help his young sister become the final participant of the Dao competition and obtain the fairy book of longevity. The door of the study room was pushed open, and someone walked in along with the wind and snow. He knew that the person who came in was his father, Jing of Silla, without using the secret code of knocking on the door or asking for permission. The little princess of the Qin kingdom has been found. She is in Beihai County. She should have been brought into his manor by the governor of Beihai. In your opinion, when will Beihai rebel? It was evident that Jing of Silla trusted his son, who had just turned 10 years old. He even asked for Jing Jiu's opinion on such an important matter. After thinking for a while, Tong Yin said, "I'm afraid that the governor of Beihai will hand the princess over to the Qin emperor in exchange for some benefits." Jing of Silla was surprised by Jing Jiu's judgment. The people of Beihai are valiant, and their army is very strong. The son of the governor is called the young martial god. Now that the little princess is in their hands, how can they not be tempted? Tong Yin knew the identity of that young martial god. In fact, he had been communicating with Beihai County in private over the last 2 years. The governor of Beihai is a bit cowardly, and it's too cold to make up his mind. It's hard for him to make up his mind. After some thought, Jingjiu said, try to find a way to send the Qi Kingdom to help them. In addition, ask my father to send some spies to spread the news in Xianying City. Maybe it will work. Jing of Silla was overjoyed. My son's plan is brilliant, he said. Tong Yin thought that this wasn't a scheme, so he didn't want to continue this topic. What does father think of Zhao's state? He asked. Jing of Silla said disdainfully, that fatuous ruler won't die no matter how you look at it. Zhao still has to suffer. When he dies, I'm afraid Zhao will be crippled. In just a few years, 2 emperors had died in the 5 kingdoms, and 2 new monarchs had arrived. The new emperor of the Qin kingdom already had the reputation of being cruel and tyrannical. The new emperor of the Chu kingdom was not only an idiot, but also a fatuous emperor. However, if one were to talk about a truly incapable ruler, it would have to be the emperor of the state of Zhao, who had a pair of fish eyes. If one were to write down all the evil, scandalous, and absurd things that this incapable emperor had done, the paper in the capital Luoyang would be unreasonably expensive. Since ancient times, eunuchs had always been accompanied by incompetent rulers. The chief eunuch who was most favored by the emperor of the state of Zhao was surnamed Hong. Although he wasn't extremely powerful, he was still feared by everyone. One evening, when the sky was dark, eunuch Hong didn't leave the palace. He was resting on a chair in the courtyard. A young eunuch about 10 years old knelt beside him. He held a palm leaf fan in his hand and carefully fanned him. At the same time, he quietly drove away the mosquitoes and flies. After fanning for a long time, eunuch Hong still didn't open his eyes. The young eunuch's arm became heavy, but he didn't dare to stop or change hands. The day before yesterday, he had fanned here all night. His right arm was red and swollen, and he had no strength at all. When the last trace of twilight disappeared, eunuch Hong finally opened his eyes. The young eunuch was somewhat happy, thinking that he finally didn't have to fan all night. However, he was also somewhat disappointed. He wondered if eunuch Hong felt that his fanning wasn't good enough. Eunuch Hong looked at him. A trace of interest appeared in his murky eyes. How long have you been in the palace? He asked. The young eunuch put on a smile and replied, Grandfather, almost 5 years. Eunuch Hong said, At the beginning, you were beaten for a year. Then you spent a year not being beaten again. You spent another 2 years before I could see you again. What did you pay to pick up this fan? Just as the old eunuch was beginning to speak, the young eunuch had already begun to kowtow. His forehead bumped against the floor. Hearing the last question, the young eunuch lowered his head and said, I gave away all the money I had saved in the previous 4 years. I also stabbed someone with a knife. You're so young, yet you know how to give your weakness to me. You're really smart. In order to improve yourself, you're willing to use any means necessary. Eunuch Hong narrowed his eyes and said, Even your aptitude is not bad. But why should I teach you? Hejan turned his head to look at the small courtyard. There was no resentment on his pale face, only gratitude and reverence. Of course, this was a pretense. However, even though eunuch Hong had refused his request, he had indeed gained some benefits. There were so many eunuchs in the royal palace, but how many of them were qualified to fan the eunuch Hong and drive away the mosquitoes? It was thought that he would live a better life in the near future, and the concubine Ping might even reward him with some good things for the sake of the eunuch Hong. Yet, he still felt a bit depressed when he thought of what eunuch Hong had said. That's right, why should I? He also wanted to shout at the sun in the sky, why should I? Why should I live such a miserable life and live such a servile life? Eunuch Hong was the strongest swordsman in the royal palace of Zhao Zhao, but he was merely in the middle state of the golden pill if he were in Chaotian. Yet, he had no choice but to bow and scrape to the eunuch Hong, trying to please him. It was because he had no way to cultivate his own magic method after being castrated. All he could do was find a suitable magic method in this world. Yet, what eunuch Hong said was right. Why? There was a fork in the road ahead. One road led to the concubine Ping Palace, and the other led to the royal garden. The royal garden was a bit desolate in recent years. It was said that the emperor had drowned too many palace servant girls there, and the place was haunted by ghosts. Even the girls waiting to be selected wouldn't go there to try their luck, to say nothing of the eunuchs who believed in ghosts and gods in the afterlife. Hejan walked toward the royal garden, intending to take a walk. It was getting late at night. The lights in the distant palace were very bright, and the wild grass grew very long in the royal garden, looking like the shadows of ghosts. Hejan was of course not afraid. He walked to the deep end of the royal garden, ready to climb up the artificial hill and lie down for a while. All of a sudden, he found someone else was in the royal garden that night. There was a small chestnut tree by the lake. A thin and weak youth stood under the chestnut tree. The youth wore a light yellow cloth, his expression a bit gloomy. Hejan knew that he was the crown prince of Zhao State, a few years older than him, and that he was not a participant in the Dao competition. In the next few nights, Hejan saw the crown prince of Zhao State in the royal garden. What he didn't understand was why the crown prince looked at the distance thoughtfully while stroking a tree branch, even though he was not a participant in the Dao competition. Your father is a bad emperor, and it's indeed a disgrace. But do you think your life is worse than a little eunuch like me? Looking at the figure under the small chestnut tree and the terrain by the lake one night, Hejan made up his mind. He came to the royal garden ahead of time. After making sure that nobody was by the lake, he walked under the tree and took out the small knife that he always carried with him, starting to cut the tree branch slowly. He was careful not to cut the tree branch in half. Then he sealed the cut with the mud and cleaned up the wood shavings and other traces of the tree branch. Then he waited for the crown prince to fall into the lake because the tree branch was cut off. Yet, the event that Hejan thought would change the history didn't happen, either because he didn't cut it deep enough or because the crown prince's hand was too weak and weak. Summer passed and autumn came. Hejan had given up, and he even forgot about it. One afternoon, as he squatted by the lake to reward himself, he suddenly heard a cracking sound from above. The crown prince fell down the slope and rolled to the edge of the lake. Then he saw a little eunuch with an oily mouth looking at him in astonishment. The crown prince was slightly angry, thinking that if he hadn't been frightened by the smoke and fire, he wouldn't have broken the tree branch and fallen down, ending up in such a sorry state. He was just about to teach the little eunuch a lesson when the eunuch suddenly pounced on him and covered his mouth, shushing him incessantly, his eyes pleading for mercy. Seeing the little eunuch's pitiful appearance, the crown prince's heart softened. The little eunuch slowly released his hand and said fawningly, "Don't shout, don't shout. I'll share the fish with you." The crown prince looked at the roasted fish on the tree branch in his hand and asked in surprise, "Where did this fish come from?" The little eunuch replied matter-of-factly, "Of course the fish comes from the lake. How could it come from the tree?" The crown prince became even angrier, wondering which palace this little eunuch came from to have such a sharp tongue. The little eunuch tore off a piece of fish and handed it to the crown prince, saying, "I didn't give it to you to shut your mouth. Look at how thin you are and how pale your face is. TSK, TSK, how miserable. Which palace are you from? Look at your cheeks, they're so thin they've sunk in, and your mouth is so sharp." The crown prince was startled and unconsciously took the fish and put it into his mouth. Then he was stunned and said, "It's really delicious." The next day, Hejan entered Eunuch Hong's courtyard again. Summer had already passed, so he didn't need to fan himself. To get this kind of good job, he needed to put in more effort. The red and swollen face was only a small price to pay. What was really useful was the jade pendant the crown prince had given him last night. As long as the crown prince was here, he would always have the jade pendant, so he didn't feel bad about it. He cleaned up the courtyard and then walked into the inner room, kneeling in front of Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong was surprised to see that it was this child and asked, "Have you thought of an answer?" That question could be summed up in 3 words. "Why?" Hejan said, "Last night, I had a roasted fish with His Highness the Crown Prince." Eunuch Hong's murky eyes lit up and he laughed, saying, "Not bad, not bad." With the blue bird's attentive observation, the people outside the Huin Valley naturally wouldn't miss the wonderful stories in the illusionary realm. Seeing that Eunuch Hong finally began to teach Hejan martial arts, and thinking of his miserable life in the past 10 years, the people couldn't help but feel sentimental and silent. Suddenly, a crisp clap came from under a tree. It was Sensei who was clapping. She had a piece of dried fish in her mouth, looking like those cute little sea animals on the shores of the West Sea. I'm a little tired from sitting here, so I'm going to walk around somewhere else. Do you want to come with me? She said to Shui Yununri. Shui Yununri was a little surprised, asking, You don't want to watch the rest? Sensei said, There's nothing to watch in the middle. It'll be more interesting when those guys grow up. Growing up overnight was just an adjective in the real world, but it would happen in the Dao competition. 5 days later, Sensei and Shui Yununri came back from the Hanshi Valley with the fragrance of flowers all over their bodies. The participants in the illusionary realm were already 15 years old. Regardless of which world they were in, 15 years old was considered an adult. They would encounter many troubles when they grew up, and they would face life and death. After years of effort, Tong Yin had found out the whereabouts of a dozen participants in the Dao competition. He didn't do anything right away. All he did was observe their growth in secret. He would only help them at certain critical moments, or strike them down, or even kill them directly. Yet, something strange had happened this spring. A few participants of the Dao competition had died mysteriously before he could strike. According to the investigation of his subordinates, the killer didn't belong to any force, and he struck alone every time. The 26 participants were all the strongest swordsmen of the young generation. They entered the illusionary realm at the same time and started cultivating at the same time. Normally, their cultivation states should be similar, but the killer could kill them so quickly and cleanly. It was evident that his cultivation state was much higher than that of the dead. Who was it that could cultivate so quickly? Tong Yin took out the book from a secret drawer and moved his fingers slowly over the names. In terms of talent in cultivation and cultivation state before entering the illusionary realm, Jing Jiao was the strongest, but it was difficult for him to leave the royal palace. Even if he could, he wouldn't bother to do so. Who was the killer then? Tong Yin rubbed the center of his brows. He found that his impression of these names was fading away, like the ink characters on the paper. Over the years, he would take out this book and review it from time to time. But the memory was still fading away, as if it had happened a long time ago, or even in his last life. Time was indeed the most dreadful, merciless, and irresistible divine weapon. He wondered how the rest of the participants could retain their memories, or had many of them lost themselves in the mortal world. Jiang Rui left his small courtyard to buy a horse-drawn carriage. He hadn't lived a good life over the years, but as a cultivation practitioner, he had enough money to buy a horse-drawn carriage. He hadn't forgotten about the assassination of Hejan's entire family, but he had forgotten most of what had happened before entering the illusionary realm. Fortunately, he hadn't forgotten about the Dao competition and those participants. He knew that he had to keep on climbing until he reached the peak of power and influence, and then meet the godly commissioner to ask for the tripod. No matter how big the goal was, he had to start from a small one. A few years ago, he did something trivial. He pushed his father, who was addicted to gambling and drinking, into the river and threw many stones into the river. Then, he used the money he had stolen and robbed to buy a dozen acres of land for his mother, and hired a few honest and capable workers, and arranged a good marriage for his younger sister. Later, he went to the town to study, read books, and write poems, and made a name for himself. He became acquainted with the county magistrate and advanced step by step, but it was too slow to do so, and he always felt that a force was hindering his progress. He didn't know that this force came from the distant Sangzhou. He thought it was because the town was too small. There must be something wrong with the crown prince of King Jing, the idiotic little emperor, and the young martial god from Beihai County. Those people were already in high positions, but he was still trying to please the county magistrate. How could he do that? While walking on the street and thinking of all this, Jiang Rui felt his body heating up and a lofty feeling arose in his chest. Then, he suddenly found that something was wrong. Chapter 376. The man in black was a bit short. His face was covered with a black cloth, so his eyes and brows couldn't be seen. Sensing the danger, Jiang Rui said with narrowed eyes, "I didn't expect you to start killing each other so soon." The man in black said listlessly, "Shouldn't you be curious about how I found you first and then feel sentimental about it? You are such an idiot. You deserve to die." Jiang Rui thought of something and felt relaxed, smiling without saying a word. There was no cultivation sect here, no magic pills, and no master here. "My talent is better than yours, but how can I be worse than yours?" This was something he had been brooding about, or in other words, all the free-traveling practitioners except for Hejan had been brooding about it. In the eyes of those free-traveling practitioners, they could reach the same cultivation state as the disciples of the major sects simply by practicing their own magic methods. If they could have a wise master and so many precious magic pills to eat, what would they be compared to? The illusionary realm of Cloud Dream had at least made up for this difference in some aspects. As such, Jiang Rui was quite confident that his opponent was no match for him, regardless of whether he was Jingjiu, Bai Qianjun, or Tongyan. The man in black yawned and said, "You are indeed an idiot. Think about it. If your talent was as good as Hejan's, there would be many cultivation sects begging to take you in. It wouldn't be like this." The smile on Jiang Rui's face faded away gradually. It was because the man in black's words had hit the nail on the head. It was because of the name Hejan. A gust of wind suddenly rose on the street, and the green leaves were blown down like arrows, leaving mottled marks on the wall. Jiang Rui bumped into the wall heavily, his chest full of sword wounds, dripping with blood, as if he had been tortured by 1,000 cuts. Looking at the black-clothed man walking towards him, his pale face showed despair and anger. He felt despair because he sensed death, and he was angry because he couldn't figure out how this person could be so much stronger than him, since they were both participants of the Tao competition and there are no masters or magic pills here. All of a sudden, a ghostly figure appeared, rolling up the green leaves that had just stopped falling and heading toward the man in black. When the black-clothed man saw such a strange and fast movement technique, his expression changed slightly. He formed a sword seal with his right hand, and an extremely bright sword light appeared. With a soft sound, the sword light returned to his body, and the ghost-like shadow also returned to the shadows behind the wall. The black-clothed man was somewhat puzzled when he confirmed that the ghost did not use the heaven and earth escape technique of Zhongzhou school or Jingjiu's innate invisible sword body. Among the 26 participants of the Tao competition, who else had such a strange and unpredictable movement? Was it possible that that person was not a participant in the Tao competition, but a cultivation swordsman in this world? Just as he was about to break down the wall and fight, the sound of hooves suddenly came from the distance. It was obvious that it was not the bailiffs of the county, but the cavalrymen of Luo State. The look in the man's eyes changed again. Could it be that someone was protecting this rogue cultivator? Without any hesitation, he turned around and disappeared into the residence. Jiang Rui stood up with difficulty and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His eyes were filled with the joy of escaping from death, but he was also a little confused. All of a sudden, he moved away from the wall, as if he was scalded. It was because he remembered that the ghost-like shadow was behind the wall. It was strange that the ghost-like shadow had saved his life, but he was quite afraid of this person, and he was even more afraid of him than the man in black who wanted to kill him. Hejan entered the royal palace of Zhao State noiselessly. After entering the room, he took off the gray cloth covering his face, exposing his pale face. He had come back from Luo State overnight. Even though he had learned a lot of strange and unpredictable magic methods from the old eunuch Hong, he still felt exhausted. More importantly, the sword wills of that man in black were too powerful. All he wanted to do was to go back and see that person so that he wouldn't forget about him. He didn't expect to run into another participant of the Tao competition so coincidentally. He had vaguely guessed the identity of this person, and he knew that this person would continue to hide in the dark from now on. As such, he gave up on the idea of using the power of the imperial court to find him. As the morning sunlight shone brightly, he washed his face and changed into a clean cloth. Then he took out a magic pill from a hidden box and wrapped it carefully in a silk cloth before walking out of the room. As he walked in the royal palace, the eunuchs, palace servant girls, and guards all made way for him and greeted him one after another. Elder, greetings to Elder He. Good morning, little Elder He. He-Jean walked forward with an indifferent expression on his face. He came to the front of the grand hall and pushed open the door of the royal study. Looking at the pale and thin emperor behind the desk, he said in an amiable voice, "Your Majesty, it's time to take the medicine." Tong Yin put the book into the hidden compartment and took the summary of the information sent by her subordinate. She started reading it again, trying to find the answers to the questions she had asked. The most important information in the last few days was, of course, the news that the Beihai County of the Qin Kingdom had rebelled. The young martial god, ranked second in the governor manor of Beihai, had demonstrated his unstoppable prowess at the age of 15. He led the vanguard troop and conquered 5 cities in a row, forcing the army of the Qin Kingdom to retreat in defeat. However, according to the reliable information Tong Yin had received, at least 2 out of 5 of the vanguard troops, led by the young martial god, were the barbarians. Beihai County guarded the northern border of the Qin Kingdom and had been fighting against the barbarian tribes for many years. Who would have thought that the two sides would shake hands and make peace? The barbarians were even willing to send troops to help them? I wonder what kind of price Big Brother Bai paid, he thought to himself. There hadn't been any good news recently. The man in black who had assassinated the Tao Seeker hadn't been caught, and there wasn't even a trace of him. As for the ghost, in Luo State. He thought of the popular little Elder He in the royal palace of the state of Zhao, and an absurd expression appeared on his face. Jean had always been lucky. Could it be that everything had turned around after he came here? He still didn't believe that the little Elder He was Jean, not because being a eunuch was painful and shameful, but because he didn't want to believe it. Last year, the famous muddle-headed emperor of the state of Zhao died. In that story full of blood and conspiracies, the little Elder He played a very important role. He was cruel and merciless. He didn't even bat an eyelid when he poisoned the old eunuch Hong who taught him the cultivation method. Some people even believe that when the current emperor of the state of Zhao, the crown prince at that time, stabbed his father's abdomen with a knife, the little Elder He held his father's hand tightly. Tong Yin didn't have any friends. He-Jean was his only friend. He knew what He-Jean had been through over the years, and he didn't want him to change his temperament or even his temperament because of those things. Because then he would feel guilty. On the snowy street, the sound of hooves was like thunder. The gate of the governor's mansion was already open. A young general rushed in on a horse and dismounted when he came to the back garden. This young general was extremely heroic and full of strength. If one looked into the depths of his eyes, one could see a trace of ruthlessness. He took the towel handed to him by a servant and wiped himself casually. The towel could wipe the ice and snow on the armor, but it couldn't wipe the dry blood. The young general looked at himself and slightly raised his eyebrows. He was a little unhappy, but he didn't say anything and walked to the back garden. Seeing his figure disappear in the back garden, the servants and maids all breathed a sigh of relief. The young general was the second son of the governor, and he was also the famous young martial god in the northern region of the Qin Kingdom, Baizhou. The people in the governor's mansion were in awe of him. They didn't dare to whisper until he was far away. The so-called whispers were just praising the young martial god's bravery and military achievements, and of course, his true love for the princess in distress in the back garden. The governor of Beihai was a real title conferred by the commandery prince. The governor's mansion was the commandery prince's mansion. It was very magnificent. The back garden had been renovated several times, so it had a hint of royal style. The commandery prince was the cousin of the Qin emperor, who had been sent to the Chu kingdom. So by Pajuan's identity in this world was the cousin of the princess in distress. The princess of the Qin kingdom was sitting by the window, embroidering something with the help of the sunlight. Her slender fingers moved the needle back and forth, her expression peaceful and her eyelashes still. She didn't even feel down and out, let alone in distress. Baijiu walked into the back garden and poured a cup of tea for himself. He sat down opposite her. It was obvious that he was very familiar with her. In the real world, they were also cousins, but they were far apart from each other, not as close as they were now. Baijiu picked up the teacup and took a sip as he thought of these things. "Big brother, you have worked hard," the princess said to him as she inserted the needle back into the embroidery cloth. Baijiu said, "It looks like the situation is better than I thought. We should be able to pass the Gale Pass next spring." The princess wanted to talk about borrowing soldiers from the Hu people, but it was just a rumor. If he didn't say it himself, she wouldn't say too much. "That's good," she said lightly. Baijiu suddenly said, "But we are still facing a lot of resistance. If we want to restore our country as soon as possible, we need to attract more heroes to join us. If I can marry you with a righteous cause, I think it will be much smoother." The princess didn't try to find any excuse to refuse or try to bluff him away, such as to talk about it later. She said calmly, "Let's not talk about this anymore." Baijiu glanced at her, put down the teacup, and said, "The Hu people might have crossed the border. I have to get ready. I have to go now." Having said that, he left the back garden. From that day on, he never mentioned this proposal again, and he came to the back garden less often. Seeing the figure disappearing from the garden, the princess sighed softly. Now that Beihai County had joined hands with the Hu people, how could the Hu people still cross the border? The young martial god, who was brave and good at fighting, had always treated the Hu people coldly, or even cruelly. He would exterminate an entire tribe at the slightest provocation. The Hu people treated the Qin people the same way. The scene of them stabbing babies with spears was a nightmare for many people of Beihai. If they could join hands with such a deep hatred, what else would Big Brother not dare do? The flames of war raged in the north of the continent, while the south was peaceful and peaceful. The Chu kingdom had enjoyed good weather for several years in a row, with a bumper harvest and a happy life for the people. The taxation and governance of the government had reached the best level in history, and the country seemed to be in a golden age. Grand Secretary Zhang's ability to govern a country was on full display. Even Jing of Silla's military power had been quietly taken back by the imperial court thanks to his superb means. Whether it was from the perspective of a nation or individuals, they had already reached the peak. It was time for change. How could he change the fact that he was already a powerful official? Many people were privately persuading Grand Secretary Zhang to take a step forward, including his own son. In history, when powerful officials usurped the throne, they had to worry about the counterattack of the royal family and the support of the people. But now the Chu kingdom didn't have this problem. Who would support that idiotic emperor? People have to do something in life. "Father, are you satisfied with being a prime minister? The people and officials are waiting for you." Eldest young Master Zhang knelt in front of his father's bed and said with tears on his face, "Even if you don't think about this, don't you think about your future? Are you going to watch your sons die or be exiled?" Grand Secretary Zhang said, "I'm regent for His Majesty, not just a prime minister. I've done enough. Don't mention other things in the future. As for you, you'll be fine." In the end, this conversation still spread out. Eldest young Master Zhang didn't mention his fear of the future, but only said what his father had said. "I'm not a prime minister, but a prime minister." The capital was in an uproar, but no one dared to criticize or persuade him again. One day, Grand Secretary Zhang left the imperial palace and left the capital in a sedan chair. He went to Xioshan outside the city to relax. There was a thatched cottage in the mountain where Duke Missouri, a famous contemporary scholar, lived. The guards were scattered around the cottage. Grand Secretary Zhang walked into the cottage and cupped his hands to Duke Missouri, saying, "Come and play chess." Duke Missouri said with a bitter smile, "You're still in the mood to play chess?" Grand Secretary Zhang said, "Are you talking about the rumor?" After saying those words, "I feel like I'm in a good mood. I can't be any better." Duke Missouri sighed and said, "Seeing that you don't hide anything, I thought you really had that intention." Grand Secretary Zhang said indifferently, "What's the difference between me and the emperor now? After all, I just want to do something. The title is not important." A young man came in with 2 cups of coarse tea. Hearing this, he said, "If the title is not right, the words are not right. If the words are not right, the Tao will be difficult to carry out." Grand Secretary Zhang saw that the young man's eyes were calm, like an old man. He asked in surprise, "What's your name?" The young man said, "Yin Qi, the disciple of Duke Missouri." Grand Secretary Zhang said, "This name is too casual. I'm afraid you have a long way to go in this life." The young man smiled and said, "I don't know that I'm a guest in my dreams. My hometown is where my heart is at peace. I gave myself this name to remind myself not to deliberately remember who I am and where I come from." That night, Grand Secretary Zhang returned to the manor and sat with his wife. They talked about the young man they met in the Shoshan cottage during the day. "Among all the young talents I've seen, he is only inferior to two." His wife plucked a strand of hair from his collar and burned it in the oil lamp. She asked, "Who are they?" Grand Secretary Zhang said, "I've met Crown Prince Jing once when he was young, and the other person is His Majesty." His wife's hand trembled slightly. It was unclear if it was burned by the fire. "His Majesty?" she exclaimed in surprise. Grand Secretary Zhang said, "His Majesty is a wise man who looks foolish. He is unfathomable and extraordinary. Many people, including his subordinates, his son, and his old friends, try to persuade him to take a step forward. He would give different answers to all of them. He would only tell his true thoughts in front of his wife late at night." In many people's eyes, the Grand Secretary didn't want to be the emperor because he was satisfied with the current situation, but they were not satisfied. For instance, his most loyal subordinate and friend, the Minister of Rights, thought that if he didn't want to be the emperor, when would he be able to become the Grand Secretary? The most dissatisfied person was the eldest son of the Zhang family, thinking that if the Grand Secretary didn't want to be the emperor, he would have no hope and would be in danger in the future. The change of a dynasty was the most profitable business in the world. The benefits were so great that many people were tempted and wanted to kill him. The Grand Secretary made it clear that he wouldn't do anything about it. As a result, some people started to do something about it in private. One early morning, a few water carts from Spring Mountain passed the inspection of the guards and entered the royal palace. Chapter 377. It was common to assassinate the emperor, and it wasn't uncommon for a subordinate to kill the emperor and then help his master ascend the throne. Many people wore the yellow robe to protect their honor, and some of them were forced to do so. The Grand Secretary Zhang didn't know about the assassination, and neither did the emperor. But many people knew about it in advance. The guards in the royal palace were all the subordinates of the Grand Scholar. Though they didn't receive the direct order, they knew where the assassin hiding in the cart came from, so they kept silent. Those eunuchs who had heard the news trembled in their beds, not daring to look out of the window. The whole royal palace was in an eerie silence. The Grand Secretary Zhang got up and washed himself. He put on his official robe with the help of his wife, ready to attend the court meeting. But he found that one of his sons was missing. "Where's your big brother?" he asked with furrowed brows. The sons of the Zhang family eyed each other and said nervously, "Big brother met some friends last night. It seems that he drank too much, so he stayed outside and hasn't come back yet." The Grand Secretary Zhang was a bit angry, but he didn't think too much about it. He didn't feel the atmosphere in the royal palace that day was a bit strange until he got into the sedan. The eldest young Master Zhang didn't drink wine, nor did he stay with a prostitute. He sat in a room in the deep end of a large mansion in the capital. The morning sunlight was dim, and the room was dark behind the paper window. It was hard to see people's faces, and only a dozen breathing sounds could be heard. The people in this room were the young officials of the imperial court, who followed the Grand Scholar's lead. The eldest young Master Zhang wasn't qualified to sit in the first position, no matter in terms of seniority or official position. But the people in the room had no objection, and they behaved more respectfully than usual. After the assassination, the eldest young master would be the crown prince. He could sit on the throne, not to mention the first position. There was no news for a long time. The atmosphere in the room became even more depressing, as if they were sitting on pins and needles. Finally, someone couldn't sit still anymore. He got up and walked to the window, saying anxiously, Even if the assassin failed, what about those guards? In many mansions in the capital of the Chu kingdom, the officials who had received the news were all in a nervous mood. Some officials claimed that they were sick and didn't attend the court meeting, while some, like the Minister of Rights, rushed to the royal palace and waited with a flushed face. The morning light moved from the floor of the imperial palace to the windows, passing through and illuminating the carved floor of the hall, reflecting the ripples of light like water. The sun had risen. Jingjiu opened his eyes and had the same question as the other officials. Why isn't he here yet? To him, the imperial palace was a great place for cultivation. It was no different from Aoyama. He did not want to leave, but it seemed that as he grew older, there would only be more and more troubles. He was ready to leave. He had already confirmed the location of the mountain and was prepared to fake his death and hide his identity to become a savage in the mountain, who knew that the assassin would never appear. Suddenly, a few muffled sounds came from outside the hall, followed by footsteps, shouts, and the sound of weapons rubbing against each other. They were getting closer and closer. How did a secret assassination turn into such an intense battle? Jingjiu was a little surprised. He stood up and walked out of the hall. Pushing open the door, the sunlight was a little dazzling. He squinted his eyes. The palace gate was half closed, and the corpses of several assassins were piled there. There were even more corpses inside the palace walls. Other than the assassins in plain clothes, there were also a dozen guards. Blood flowed everywhere, giving off a faint smell of blood. Among the corpses and blood stood a dark and skinny young man. The young man had suffered many injuries. His body was covered in blood, and the wounds on his arms were so deep that his bones could be seen. However, his hands that held the hilt of his sword were still as steady as ever. The palace gate was finally forced open by the guards outside. The corpses of the assassins were sent flying. Dozens of guards shouted to protect the emperor as they swarmed in, surrounding the dark and skinny young man in the middle. Some of the guards tried to get in front of Jingjiu, but they were stopped by a flash of sword. The flash of sword came from the hand of the dark and skinny young man. A bloody battle was about to break out. No matter how fierce the dark and skinny young man was, he could only end up dead or captured. This is not what you should do. Jingjiu's voice echoed outside the hall, passing through the corpses of the assassins and guards, bringing with it the smell of blood. He walked down the stone steps and came to the side of the dark and skinny young man. Looking at the guards, he said, "He is my personal guard. Do you want to kill him?" Hearing this, the guards were very surprised. Some of them secretly exchanged glances, but in the end, they didn't dare to do anything. At this time, the imperial army finally arrived outside the hall and surrounded it tightly. The commander of the imperial army was the most trusted general of Grand Secretary Zhang. At this time, his face was as unsightly as if his mother had just died. He immediately tied up all the guards and knelt in front of Jingjiu. Jingjiu ignored him and returned to the hall with the dark and skinny young man. The commander of the imperial army was somewhat pale. He ordered his subordinates to carry the corpses out and wash the ground with clean water. Then he slowly closed the palace gate. In the early hours of the morning, Jingjiu had driven all the eunuchs and palace maids out. There was no one in the hall, and it seemed very empty and cold. Jingjiu found some ointment in the living quarters of the palace maids in the back of the hall and handed it to the dark and skinny young man, motioning for him to sit down. The dark and skinny young man should be the disciple of the No Mercy sect, but he had changed his appearance when he entered the illusionary realm, looking a bit different. Yet, Jingjiu was more familiar with this face, especially the straightforward and persistent expression in his eyes, which was hard to forget. The dark and skinny young man took off his outer garment, which had been cut into strips by the sabers and swords, and started dressing his wounds. He didn't speak a word during the whole process. Jingjiu looked out of the window and met the eyes of the bluebird on the tree branch. The bluebird flew away noiselessly. He might have gone to the royal palace of Zhao Zhao or the manor of the governor of North Sea. No matter how far the world was, it would only take a moment for him to get there. Jingjiu asked, "Why did you go to the Longevity Mountain from the Guocheng Temple?" Even if you left, shouldn't you go to Yamatai? Hasn't Zen Master already written a letter to you? It was rare for Jingjiu, who had an indifferent temperament, to ask 3 questions in a row. These 3 questions also revealed another surprising fact. This dark and skinny young man was actually Lu Shisui. Lu Shisui cultivated the Buddhism in the Guocheng Temple. Why did he participate in the Tao competition as a disciple of the No Mercy sect? The immortal sect master guessed that my young master would participate in the Tao competition, so he asked me to come here as a disciple of the No Mercy sect to help you. Since it was related to Yamatai, Lu Shisui was hesitant and didn't explain it to Jingjiu. He only told him the reason why he came here. As someone who regarded Jingjiu as a master and a father, it was a rare thing for Jingjiu to do. Jingjiu understood what was on Lu Ci's mind. As the sect master of Aoyama, Lu Ci, of course, knew that Lu Shisui had left the sword jail on the peak of Shanda Peak a long time ago, and he even knew that Lu Shisui was in the Guocheng Temple. Jingjiu had never thought of concealing this from Lu Ci, and it would be hard for him to do so given his current cultivation state. Lu Ci wanted to help Jingjiu snatch the fairy book from the hands of Zhongzhou School, so he had to prepare a helper for him. Zhuo Ruzhui was too eye-catching, so he thought of Lu Shisui in the distant Guocheng Temple. If the blue bird were still on the tree branch outside the window and spread what Lu Shisui had said to the outside world, it would cause an uproar and shock. Everybody thought that Zhongzhou School had the absolute advantage in this Tao competition because 4 of their disciples had entered the illusionary realm. Unexpectedly, the Aoyama sect had sent 3 disciples here without a sound. Not to mention Jingjiu, who represented Shui Nunnery. In the competition, Lu Shisui was also a hidden pawn. In this case, the immortal Lu's visit to the Cloud Dream Mountain was not as simple as showing his goodwill. It was more likely that he had come here to guard the Tao competition for the victory. Jingjiu asked, "How is the real qi in your body now?" Lu Shisui said, "It was a little unstable a few years ago, but the immortal sect master taught me a magic method to suppress it for the time being." Jingjiu said, "I still have to go to Yamatai after I get out of here. It can't be suppressed for long, so I have to find a way to solve it." Lu Shisui was reluctant to go to Yamatai, but since his young master had said so, he had no choice but to agree. Jingjiu was still worried that Lu Shisui had lied in order to stay in the illusionary realm to protect himself. So he stretched out a finger and pointed at the center of Lu Shisui's eyebrows. Lu Shisui didn't dare to dodge, so he sat up straight and stopped dressing his wound. A crisp bell came from the distant void, and only Jingjiu could hear it. It didn't take long for him to withdraw his finger, frowning slightly. Lu Shisui knew that his young master's expression meant something serious had happened, so he couldn't help but feel nervous, asking, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Jingjiu sensed a mark in the deep part of Lu Shisui's body. They were in the illusionary realm, and their bodies were all spiritual souls. Who could leave a mark on Lu Shisui's spiritual soul without being discovered by him? Lu Shisui's bloody demon method had reached a very high cultivation state, so the regular cultivation practitioners couldn't do it. Soon, Jingjiu realized that this should be the work of the spirit of the green sky mirror. He waved his hand to erase the mark without saying anything to Lu Shisui. After the death of the king of the underworld, Jingjiu was the one who had the best knowledge and control of the spiritual souls in heaven and earth and in the illusionary realm. Even his big brother was inferior to him, to say nothing of a mirror spirit. It was then that the blue bird flew back to the royal palace of the Chu kingdom and landed on a tree branch. Jingjiu didn't say anything. Lu Shisui fell silent as well, continuing to bandage the wounds on his body with his head lowered. Looking at the thin and dark youth with wounds all over his body, the blue bird felt puzzled, wondering why the mark he had left on this remnant of the bloody demon church had disappeared. The news of the assassination of the emperor would spread quickly, no matter how hard they tried to conceal it. The atmosphere in the court meeting became exceedingly tense and depressing. The Grand Secretary Zhang had a gloomy expression on his face. He glanced at his subordinates, as if there were hidden thunders in his eyes that were about to explode. In the end, he didn't say anything. He entered the royal palace as quickly as he could and came to the front of the grand hall, asking to see the emperor earnestly. The gate of the palace opened slowly. Looking at the thin and dark youth, the Grand Secretary Zhang thought of what the commander of the royal army said, feeling puzzled, wondering when the emperor had established contact with the cultivation practitioners outside the palace. The corpses of the assassins and the guards had been carried away, and the ground had been washed a few times with clean water, but the faint smell of blood still lingered. The black flies that came out of nowhere were humming cheerfully in the air. Smelling the faint smell of blood and thinking of the dangers here, the Grand Scholar's face grew even more unsightly. As he arrived in the Grand Hall and saw the young emperor leaning against the bed, the Grand Scholar strode forward slowly and knelt down on the ground with a solemn expression on his face. Chapter 378. If the populace of the Chu kingdom, especially the officials in the imperial court, saw this scene, they would be shocked speechless. It was a matter of course to kneel to the emperor, even if the emperor was an idiot. But this was Grand Secretary Zhang. Lu Shui knew who the mastermind of this murder was and what this Grand Secretary meant in the Chu kingdom, but he thought it was normal. He asked Jing Jiao, "Shall we kill him?" Grand Secretary Zhang's expression didn't change, as if he hadn't heard the question, nor did he turn around to flee. He had made his attitude clear by entering the palace hall alone. "Don't make trouble." Jing Jiao waved his hand, motioning for the Grand Secretary to stand up. Grand Secretary Zhang said, "Your Majesty, I didn't mean it." "I know," said Jing Jiao. Grand Secretary Zhang said after a moment of silence, "Your Majesty, if you want to govern by yourself, I can at any time. I don't want to." Jing Jiao didn't let him finish his words, saying, "Just pretend this incident never happened. You take care of the aftermath yourself." After Grand Secretary Zhang left the royal palace to deal with the aftermath, he didn't forget to call back those palace maids and eunuchs, because the emperor couldn't be without servants. The palace gate was tightly shut, and the royal army surrounded it tightly. Even the flies that smelled the blood couldn't get in, let alone the assassins. Those eunuchs and palace maids were terrified, not knowing when the palace gate would be opened and a massacre would ensue. Sensei trembled the whole night. The next day, the sun rose as usual. The palace gate was opened, and the royal army retreated. The royal palace was extremely bright in the morning light. Everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. Of course, there were some changes. For example, the Minister of Rights, who was in the prime of his life, was suddenly stripped of his position, and several young officials were demoted, banished, or poisoned to death in the forests in the south. The eldest young Master Zhang was driven back to his hometown to guard his grandfather's grave. It was not until many years later that he was escorted back to the capital by the cavalrymen of the imperial court. There was also a small but noticeable change in the royal palace. His Majesty now had a small guard by his side. The little guard stayed by His Majesty's side at all times. At night, he would stand guard outside the hall, as if he never needed to sleep. The Tao competition had entered a new phase. The most obvious sign was that some participants had died and left the illusionary realm. In a cave dwelling in the depths of the Huin Valley, a cool breeze slowly brushed past an ancient bronze mirror. A cultivator opened his eyes. Looking at the scene in front of him, his eyes were somewhat dazed. He gradually came to his senses and understood what had happened. He had stayed in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror for 15 years. As he opened his eyes, he found that only a few days had passed in the real world. Looking at the green sky mirror in front of him, the cultivation practitioner found it was different from when he entered it. The gentle wind acted like an invisible hand, pushing the green sky mirror to rotate at a very slow speed. The sunlight that shone down from the top of the cave kept changing. The tiny sesame-like figures seemed to come to life. The gaze of the cultivation practitioner moved around the green sky mirror. He instinctively wanted to find the location of the Qi kingdom and see those people he knew. Suddenly, he realized that it was all fake. But if the 15 years were merely a dream, Why was the memory so vivid? He felt a bit frustrated. This feeling was very complicated and hard to describe in words. If a regular person had experienced it, they would probably go crazy or be immersed in it, and it would be hard for them to get rid of it. The cultivation practitioners were in a better state, but it was still hard for them to come to their senses in a short time. However, if they could digest and absorb the insights they had gained during the process, their Tao heart would be firmer. This was the purpose of the Tao competition. A few more cultivation practitioners opened their eyes and woke up one after another. They had experienced the same process as the previous cultivation practitioner. It took them a while to accept the reality, and they began to discuss what they had encountered in the illusionary realm. Then, they found that they had all been killed by an assassin in black with a high cultivation state and formidable fighting prowess. Who was that assassin in black? Looking at those cultivation practitioners who hadn't woken up yet, they were trying to guess the identities of those people in the illusionary realm. Jingjiu should be the emperor of the Chu kingdom, and Bai Zhao should be the princess of the Qin kingdom who had met with misfortune. And that person, their gazes fell on Zhuo Ruzhui. Zhuo Ruzhui's eyes were closed, as if he were in a deep sleep. He didn't look any different from usual, but for some reason, an extremely faint killing intent was slowly seeping out from his body. The cultivation practitioners eyed each other, letting out a bitter smile. They had guessed the identity of the assassin in black, thinking that their deaths were not unjustified. This little weirdo of the Aoyama sect didn't want to achieve hegemony in the illusionary realm, but wanted to kill people wholeheartedly. How many people could stop him? Another cultivation practitioner opened his eyes and woke up. He was dressed like a scholar, and he was the disciple of the Kunlun sect who thought highly of himself. This disciple of the Kunlun sect looked around with a perplexed look in his eyes. Suddenly, he began to cry in extreme grief. The cultivation practitioners who had woken up earlier didn't show any mocking expressions, because they could empathize with him. Moreover, they didn't look any better when they had just woken up. After some time, the disciple of the Kunlun sect finally accepted the reality and stopped crying. A cultivation practitioner who knew him asked with concern, "Fellow cultivator Chiu, how did you get out? Were you also found by a black-robed assassin?" The disciple of the Kunlun sect was surnamed Chiu Qingdao. Startled, he asked, "What black-robed assassin?" That cultivation practitioner was a bit surprised and asked, "If that little weirdo didn't find you, how could you leave the illusionary realm so early with your ability?" Chiu Qingdao sighed and said, "I landed in the Seven Gods sect of the Luo kingdom. I cultivated arduously and managed it meticulously. It wasn't easy for me to win the trust of the sect master and be selected to help the emperor refine pills. I had planned to stay in the palace for dozens of years, subdue the emperor, and become the sect master in the future. Then, I would establish a kingdom with the sect master. But unexpectedly, the army of Beihai County, which was attacking Zhang County of the Qin kingdom, suddenly turned south and attacked the private army of the Jing of Silla of the Chu kingdom. In less than 20 days, the armies of the two kingdoms had broken into the capital and burned the imperial palace to ruins. I was unlucky and couldn't escape. Of course, even if I could escape, what could I do? I'm afraid the mountain gate of the Seven Gods sect has been destroyed." These cultivation practitioners had lived in the illusionary realm for 15 years. When they heard that the Luo kingdom, one of the 5 kingdoms, had been destroyed just like that, they couldn't help but sigh with emotion and remain silent. Only one of the cultivators exclaimed in shock, "What? The Luo kingdom has been destroyed? When did this happen?" Chiu Qingdao shot a glance at that person and asked, "When did you come out?" The cultivation practitioner said, "I came out 2 hours earlier than you did." Chiu Qingdao said, "The armies of the two kingdoms arrived less than 30 days after you left." Hearing this, the cultivation practitioner was taken aback a bit. Thinking of his relatives and friends in the illusionary realm, a hint of pain showed in his eyes. "Are you from a Luo kingdom?" asked Chiu Qingdao. The cultivation practitioner bowed to him and said, "I'm ashamed to say this. I was only a regular official in the imperial court when I died. But I've heard of your great reputation in the imperial palace. A young Taoist priest who had helped the emperor to make the magic pills had such a great reputation. So, it couldn't be a good one. So he couldn't explain it clearly. Yet, Qiu Qingdao didn't feel ashamed at all. On the contrary, he stroked his short beard, feeling a bit complacent. Soon, his complacency disappeared, replaced by anger. It was because he found that he was the sixth one to come out. There were still 20 participants in the illusionary realm. He had an outstanding talent and outstanding methods. But why was he eliminated so early? Looking at those sleeping soundly with their eyes closed, Qiu Qingdao yelled, his eyes full of pain and anger. It's not fair. Why are they the crown Prince Jing, the young master of the North Sea, and the idiotic emperor the moment they enter the illusionary realm? Why do we have to climb up from the lowest level? Hearing this, the cultivation practitioners who had just woken up displayed the same emotion on their faces. Thinking of the hardships and humiliation he had suffered at the Seven Godly Church and in the imperial palace over the last 15 years, Qiu Qingdao sneered and rolled up his sleeve, heading toward a place along with a gust of wind. Jing Jiu was sitting there with his eyes closed. If Qiu Qingdao were to be asked which participant he hated the most, it would be the idiotic emperor of the Chu kingdom. It was believed that most of the participants had the same thought. Of course, he didn't dare kill Jing Jiu. It was just that he had just woken up from the illusionary realm, so he was still in a trance. He wanted to vent his anger and humiliation. If the wind from his sleeve landed on Jing Jiu's spiritual soul in the green sky mirror would be disturbed, and something terrible might happen. All of a sudden, a crisp bell rang out. A small glass bell appeared in front of Jing Jiu, nullifying the wind from his sleeve. It was then that Qing flew out from the green sky mirror. She flapped her transparent wings and brought up a gust of violent wind, rolling up Qiu Qingdao's body and throwing him out from the top of the cave. His dreadful screams could be heard in the sky. It was unclear where he would land and how he would end up. Qing looked at the other 5 cultivation practitioners who had just woken up, the expression in her eyes extremely cold. The 5 cultivation practitioners restrained their emotions, indicating that this incident had nothing to do with them. Qing didn't pay any attention to these people. She looked at the small glass bell in front of Jing Jiu, her expression a bit strange, thinking that this person was really strange and had so many good things with him. Qing returned to the green sky mirror and transformed into the blue bird, flying back and forth between the northern Qin and the southern Chu. Once in a while, she would go to the state of Zhao to take a look. Time passed slowly while she was flying. 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye. Many things had happened in the last 3 years. With the secret help of the Hu cavalry and the Jing of Silla, the rebellion in Beihai County had finally succeeded, and the army had marched into Xianyang. The governor of Beihai had officially become the emperor. The second imperial decree he issued was to appoint Bai Zhou as the crown prince. This matter didn't exceed everyone's expectations. The young martial god Bai Zhou was ranked second, but he played the most important role in mobilizing the troops, establishing countless contributions. His elder brother had volunteered to stay in Beihai before the rebellion began, indicating that he had given up. However, it was disappointing that he died not long after the imperial decree to appoint the crown prince was issued. It was said that he had died of illness, but nobody knew whether he had committed suicide or been killed. The unfortunate princess was also invited to Xianyang City and was appointed as the Grand Princess of the Protector State by the new emperor. It seemed to be a noble title, but it was not. Everybody in Xianyang City knew that this princess of the previous dynasty had been imprisoned in the cold palace and might not be able to come out for the rest of her life. The situation in Qin did not calm down very quickly. Many volunteer armies, in the name of supporting the princess, attacked Xianyang City one after another. Bai Zhou led the army to kill everywhere. His military law was still strict, but his means were more and more brutal. He often slaughtered villages and forced people to surrender. No one called him the young general anymore, but the god of slaughter. As the secret supporter of the new emperor of the Qin kingdom, the Jing of Silla of the Chu kingdom had also gained great benefits. A large area of fertile land of the Luo kingdom had been given to Tsangzhou. The food problem that had troubled the father and son for many years had finally been solved. Maybe because of this, the Crown Prince Jing had been in a good mood these days. When the first snow fell, he asked his subordinates to push his wheelchair to the lake to enjoy the snow. In fact, he was not in a good mood. There was a faint shadow and displeasure in his eyes. The situation in the Qin kingdom had always been under his control. Bai Zhou's military achievements were attributed to his advice. But now he felt that the situation seemed to be gradually deviating from the right direction. It was not because the princess was imprisoned, which was what the three of them had discussed. It was because of what Bai Zhou had done recently. In his view, what senior brother Bai was doing was against the harmony of heaven. Even if this was an illusion and the people inside were not real people, it was still inappropriate. Moreover, it was based on one's nature. If senior brother Bai was slightly lost, it would be quite disadvantageous to the overall situation. The boats on the lake did not stop during the first snow. There were even more boats than usual. It seemed that he was not the only one who wanted to enjoy the snow. The girls and guests on the boats looked at the wheelchair by the lake and the guards and swordsmen scattered around. They guessed the identity of the person in the wheelchair and exclaimed in surprise. They bowed to greet him from a long distance away. The girls kept waving their sleeves, hoping that the crown prince would suddenly be interested and come to the boat to take a look. Suddenly, a pigeon flew to the lake in spite of the cold. It landed on the wheelchair and was taken away by a hand. Looking at the people on the boat, Tong Yin smiled and said, "What on earth did the crown prince say to Wanshu?" The subordinate opened the message brought by the pigeon and said with a grave expression, "Mr. Xiang is dead." The expression in Tong Yan's eyes changed slightly, but he still maintained a smile on his face. "Did the crown prince do it?" The subordinate said, "No, it should be that man in black." Tong Yin felt a bit relieved, saying, "He's getting closer. It looks like his next target is me." The first participant he found in the Dao competition was his young brother Xiang Wanshu. Xiang Wanshu had hidden himself well, and was responsible for the communication between him, Bai Zhou, and the princess. Neither the Jing of Silla nor his own spy organization knew of the existence of Xiang Wanshu. Since that man in black could find Xiang Wanshu, it meant that he had other sources of information besides keeping an eye on Jingjiu. "You came out of the manor house to wait for me to kill you. But aren't you afraid that I'll surprise you by hiding in the lake water?" A lazy voice suddenly burst out in the snow. The guards of the manor house pulled out their weapons in tandem, their expressions grave, as if they were facing a formidable foe. A man in black had appeared in the world over the last few years. He had a high cultivation state and formidable fighting prowess, challenging the highly achieved swordsmen everywhere and killing countless people. It was said that he had a grudge against the manor house. The guards of the manor house had been on guard against this man, but they didn't expect him to come so close to them undetected. Tong Yin said with the same expression, "You've never tried to assassinate me. You've always fought me face to face. Why should I be afraid of you? You're the Crown Prince Jing, different from those pitiful guys. If I want to kill you, I won't care so much." A man wearing a conical hat walked out from the wind and snow. He exuded a lazy aura, but he also exuded a sharp, murderous intent, like a sheathed sword. "Tong," Yin said while looking at the man, "I used to think you were Jingjiu, but you look a bit like him today." The man pulled back the conical hat, exposing an ordinary and unfamiliar face, saying, "You know I'm not him." Looking at the man's eyes, Tong Yin asked uncertainly, "Rujui?" Chapter 379. The man in black with the conical hat was Zhuo Rujui. All the participants who had left the illusionary realm had been killed by him. "Why did you do it?" Tong Yin suddenly asked. They said that they were the ruler of the world, and they asked for the ownership of the bronze tripod. But the wars are endless, and the lives have been plunged into misery and suffering. It's too bloody and too slow. As such, I came up with a simple method. Zhuo Rujui continued. "As long as I can kill all the other participants, I'll be the final winner. Your idea is quite sensible. Unfortunately, nobody can do it no matter how talented you are and how strong your fighting prowess is. Tong Yin pointed to the gloomy sky and said, "The sky here is covered with a lid." What she said was an implicit reference. The highest cultivation state in the illusionary realm was the initial state of the Yuanying, or the initial state of the free travel. This was the established rule. On the premise that there was an upper limit, the difference in talent among the participants in the Dao competition would be lessened. Even though Zhuoruzhui had a formidable talent and reached the initial state of the free travel faster than anybody else, he still couldn't fight against the state all by himself. Zhuoruzhui said, "Hence, I'm trying to seize the time to find all of them and kill them before those idiots catch up with me." Tong Yin said, "It's easy to find me in Jingjiu, but it's hard to find the others. For instance, I don't understand how you found Xiang Wanshu." "I found King Yang in Yinzhou," Zhuoruzhui said. Hearing the words Yinzhou and Yang, Tong Yin sighed inwardly. She had roughly figured out what had happened. She was unlucky. She was reincarnated as the son of the owner of a chess house. As a result, she was oppressed by the local influential clans. You disciples of the center sect like to meddle in other people's business. Well, don't glare at me. It's called caring about the world. Xiang Wanshu helped Yang a few times, so he was exposed. As a result, I killed him in Yang. Zhuoruzhui asked, "Well, can you guess how I found Yang? She has turned into a man, so logically speaking, it should be the hardest to discover her." After a moment of silence, Tong Yin said, "Don't try to sow discord between us. I don't expect you to kill Jingjiu, and don't count on me either." Zhuoruzhui said with a straight face, "The situation between our two sects is very different. He is my martial uncle. Of course I can't kill him. But Bai Qianjun is only your martial brother. Why can't you kill him?" Tong Yin didn't answer his question, but said, "You knew that you had no hope before you came in, so you gave up and simply killed people here?" Zhuoruzhui said, "I've been staying in the abode of Tianguang Peak for too long. I'm fine in other aspects, but I don't have much combat experience. Just like Uncle Master Jingyang, killing people here can help me improve my combat ability as quickly as possible. So I think this is also a kind of cultivation." The wind and snow suddenly stopped, and the boat on the lake began to move again. Like a leaf spinning in the air, it did not go far. The lakeside was quiet for a while. Every word of Zhuoruzhui was as sharp as a sword, but Tong Yin took it on and fought back very hard, but still couldn't hurt him. Tong Yin asked, "Are you going to continue killing people like this?" Zhuoruzhui said, "Of course, I also know that it will become more and more difficult. There are some people I don't even know where they are." Tong Yin said, "For example, Hejan and my martial sister. Don't try to trick me into going to Zhao's palace." Zhuoruzhui said with a strange expression, "I don't know what's wrong with that guy, but he has an evil aura in this world. I don't want to touch him for now." Tong Yin laughed and asked, "Then what about my martial sister? I used to think that she should be the princess in distress, but Bai Qianjun had no reason to imprison her in his back garden. Wouldn't it be more convenient for them to join hands and restore the country directly?" Zhuoruzhui said, "Later, I found that Yang had reincarnated into a man, and Bai Zhao could also reincarnate. So I couldn't make up my mind." Tong Yin said, "So you decided to kill those whose identities have been identified first." Zhuoruzhui said, "The reason you two are not afraid of being discovered is because you are either in the deep part of the palace or protected by the army, so it's not easy to kill you. But in comparison to Senior Master and Bai Qianjun in the royal palace, you are easier to kill." Tong Yin reminded him, "You let it slip." Zhuoruzhui fell silent for a while, looked at the blue bird on the branch, and said, "Master, it is the last thing I want to do to Senior Uncle. Don't misunderstand me." Tong Yin asked, "Since I'm easier to kill, why haven't you done it yet?" The participants of the Dao competition were all alone in this world. Now that they had met, it was natural for them to chat. Yet, Tong Yin and Zhuoruzhui were also observing each other while they were talking. Through their observation, Zhuoruzhui was certain that Tong Yin was born disabled, and her cultivation state was lower than his. But She was more prepared than he had imagined. Those pleasure boats on the snowy lake were real, and so were the girls on the boats, but those guests were not. There were many powerful crossbows in the cabins of the boats. The most troublesome part was that a scholar was admiring the snow with an umbrella on a small mountain not far away. That scholar had white hair on his temples. Judging from his age, he was not a participant in the Tao competition, but his energy was very powerful. "Duke Missouri, I've heard of you," Rujui said while looking at the scholar in the distance. "I heard that you're probably the strongest swordsman in this world. I'll ask for your guidance if I have the chance, but not today." The scholar closed the umbrella and walked down the mountain. The wind and snow rose again. He said to Tong Yin goodbye. "Are you sure you can leave by yourself?" asked Tong Yin. The guards and the soldiers on the pleasure boats knew that the ambush had been exposed. Countless crossbows were aimed at the shore along with the frightened screams of the girls. The guards by the lake had also moved forward a little bit. "Of course I can leave. It's because you're not the only one who is prepared." Having said that, Zhuoruzhui put on the conical hat again, turned around, and walked into the wind and snow. The leader of the guards looked at Tong Yin, waiting for his order. Tong Yin remained silent. A moment later, he raised his hand, signaling for the others not to strike. The guards were stunned, thinking that it was the best opportunity to kill the man in black since they had set up an inescapable trap and a figure like Mr. Mo. Why did the son of Duke Missouri suddenly give up? Duke Missouri came to the lakeside. Looking at the young man in the wheelchair, he was also baffled. It was then that the accumulated snow on the treetops rustled down and the bluebird flew to a higher branch. A person walked out from behind the tree. The person was dark and thin, wearing the uniform of a royal guard. Seeing this person, Tong Yin realized what Zhuoruzhui was prepared for, and he also realized that what he said to the bluebird was not only to the sect master of Aoyama, the immortal Lu, but also to the person behind the tree. He looked at the person and said, "I heard that you have never left the emperor's side. You must have come to Sangzhou for something important." The guard said, "The emperor asked me to say something to you if I couldn't kill you." Tong Yin said, "The emperor asked me to say something to you if I couldn't kill you." The guard said, "The emperor said that your people are always spreading rumors in the capital that the grand scholar is going to usurp the throne, which is quite annoying. He asked you not to do it again." Tong Yin thought that it was indeed the tone of that guy, but it was indeed annoying for that guy to say such a long sentence. Thinking of this, Jingjiu somehow felt much better. He flicked his fingers to indicate that he understood. The guard turned around and left without saying anything more. Looking at the back of the guard and thinking of the conversation he had with the grand scholar in the thatched hut, Duke Missouri was deep in thought. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr." Tong Yin said to Jingjiu. Duke Missouri said meaningfully, "Your conversation was quite interesting, though I didn't quite understand what you were talking about. Maybe it was because of this that it was interesting." Chapter 380. After returning to the manor house of Jing of Silla, Tong Yin, as usual, took out the well-worn book and started to review what had happened that day. If Duke Missouri hadn't been here today, Zhuoruzhui would have joined hands with the guard behind the tree to kill Jingjiu. Even though Jingjiu had made some preparations, and the arrows on the boat were powerful, he wouldn't have been able to stop them. Did Jingjiu really want to kill Jingjiu? Was it because of what Jingjiu had mentioned? A significant event took place in the capital of Chu Kingdom in the summer. A tall man was pacing back and forth in front of the royal palace in the wee hours of the morning. The royal guards felt something was wrong and went to interrogate him. The man took out a wooden stick and waved it around in an attempt to escape, but he was caught in the end. It turned out that this man was armed with a sharp blade and intended to break into the palace and kill the emperor. The officials of the Ministry of Justice tortured him severely during the interrogation, but the man gritted his teeth and refused to say anything more than that he wanted to kill the incapable emperor, and he didn't want to tell them who the mastermind was. In the end, the man was recognized as a captain in the Blue Rain Pass, and he had been a personal guard of General Pei. General Pei was a famous general of Chu Kingdom, and his reputation was second only to that of Jing of Silla. He had been stationed on the border between Chu and Zhao all year round, fighting against the army of Zhao state, and had made a great contribution to the state. More widely known was that this General Pei was a trusted follower of Grand Secretary Zhang. Countless gazes were fixed on the Grand Scholar manor. The Ministry of Justice didn't dare press too hard, and the capital fell into an eerie silence. It was then that the man suddenly committed suicide in the prison. All of a sudden, those who had a sense of justice, those who were good at making use of the political situation of the state, and those who had great ambitions all came forward. Countless memorials to the throne were sent to the inner court like snowflakes, and the drums outside the Supreme Court were beaten every day. Some people even secretly entered the palace at night to meet the emperor, but nobody knew what they talked about. Of course, the Jing of Silla and his son were behind this event, but more importantly, the new policies of the Grand Scholar had harmed the interests of many nobles. The Grand Scholar had been the regent for a long time, but he didn't want to take a step forward. It seemed that the Grand Scholar had shown some weakness, and many people wanted to take advantage of the Grand Scholar. The attack on the Grand Scholar had quickly turned into a storm for all sorts of reasons. The whole capital was in a precarious situation. Unless the Grand Scholar resorted to forceful means, the situation would be hard to calm down. But if the Grand Scholar resorted to forceful means, it was hard to tell what kind of turmoil it would bring. At the most tense moment, the emperor, who had never appeared in court since he ascended to the throne, suddenly appeared in court in front of all the officials. Those officials of the opposition were overjoyed, thinking that the emperor had finally come to his senses and intended to strike the Grand Scholar with the help of the current turmoil. No one had expected that His Majesty would leave with just a few words. The Grand Secretary is doing a good job. Don't make trouble. The situation in the imperial court, the inclination of the people against the Grand Scholar, and the political turmoil were all as complicated as the real turmoil. Regardless of the cause, the process, or the result, they were often unreasonable in hindsight. The emperor only had the reputation of being an incapable ruler and an idiot. What he said was without a head or tail. Normally, it shouldn't have had too much influence. But for some mysterious reason, or perhaps because of the Grand Scholar's methods, because of what he said, the storm that had engulfed Jingdo for dozens of days quietly dissipated. What followed was the counterattack. Taking advantage of this event, the Grand Scholar purged the imperial court and the provinces and counties one more time, and uncovered all those old foxes who had been hiding for many years. By then, nobody could affect his status anymore. Tong Yin knew why Jing Jiao did what he did, but she couldn't understand it. Was he really not afraid that the Grand Scholar would usurp the throne? So many people want to kill you, including me and that young master of yours. How can you survive without the title of the emperor? In this world, Lu Shisui's parents were the servants of a cultivation sect. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was the flying sword. He started to learn the sword work as soon as he could walk. From then on, he did nothing but focused on learning the sword work. At the age of 14, he became the strongest swordsman in his cultivation sect and the youngest elder in the history of the sect. His parents didn't have to work as servants anymore. Then, he went down the mountain and joined an assassin organization. He was certain that his young master was in the royal palace of the Chu kingdom. Then came the bloody story of the morning light and the water delivery cart. He had been here for 18 years. Besides learning the sword work in his cultivation sect, he worked as a bodyguard in the royal palace. This was the first time he had traveled far from home. He was in a hurry to return to the royal palace, but he could always see the scenery outside the window. The green water of the Aoyama was truly beautiful, and he was often entranced by it. Moreover, he often encountered incidents on the way, such as the mounted gangsters who blocked his carriage and the frightened horses that hurt the riders. As such, he killed a few people and saved a few others. The feeling was familiar, making the corners of his mouth curl up slightly. When he returned to the capital of the Chu kingdom, he suddenly felt that this city was somewhat unfamiliar. When he entered the royal palace, he felt that he had never seen these buildings before, but the red walls and yellow tiles were somewhat familiar. He walked into the main hall and came to the window. Looking at Jingjiu, who was lying on the couch, he opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but didn't say anything in the end. Jingjiu glanced at him and said, "Speak." Lu Shui scratched his head and said, "I feel that my memory is getting worse and worse." Jingjiu asked, "How fast is it getting worse?" Lu Shui opened his eyes wide and asked, "Who are you?" Jingjiu laughed and looked into his eyes, asking, "Who do you think I am?" Lu Shui thought seriously for a long time, then shook his head and said, "I really can't remember. I only vaguely remember that you treated me very well, and I wanted to protect you." He was very smart and also a very simple person. He didn't have any vigilance against illusions, nor did he guard against them. He hadn't been affected before because there had always been something on his mind, and he had always remembered to come and find Jingjiu. Now that he had found Jingjiu, he was no longer worried. He was gradually assimilated into this world by the scenery outside the palace, so he naturally began to forget the past. Jingjiu knew very well why this was happening. He knew that there wouldn't be any major problems, but he didn't know what Lu Shui would do next. Lu Shui patted him on the shoulder and said, "Don't be afraid. I won't abandon you and leave you alone." Jingjiu raised his eyebrows and said nothing. Lu Shui walked out of the main hall and vigilantly observed his surroundings, just as he had done for the past 3 years. 20 years of questioning. The world was at peace. Chaos was about to break out. All the rebellions in the Qin kingdom were quelled. The laws were strict and harsh, and the rewards and punishments were clear. The power of the country gradually grew stronger. But no one had seen the imprisoned princess again, and many people suspected that she was already dead. After the famous fatuous ruler, the Zhao state finally welcomed an outstanding emperor. The young emperor was excellent at governing the country. He didn't yield a single step to the powerful Qin kingdom, and he pushed forward step by step against the great Qi kingdom. The only worry was that his health wasn't very good. The Qi kingdom had a vast territory, a large population, developed commerce, and rich people. But because the officials in the imperial court were powerless, the kingdom had always been under the shadow of the Zhao state, especially that elder he. His methods were too cruel, and he exploited them too harshly. Even the most generous merchants weren't willing to endure it. Those merchants hired many assassins to try to kill him, but they didn't succeed. Luo's state was destroyed, and it was being forgotten at a very fast speed. Most of it went to the Qin kingdom, and the rest was divided between the Zhao state and the Chu kingdom's Jing of Silla. The Chu kingdom was somewhat similar to the Qi kingdom. The people were proud of the extravagant life, and the people of the kingdom were gentle and had no ambition or vision. It wasn't until the years when Grand Secretary Zhang was in power that the Chu kingdom vaguely began to feel like a prosperous and superior country. The problem was that the seemingly prosperous and powerful Chu kingdom always had 2 fatal hidden worries that it couldn't get rid of. The 2 hidden worries were the same: the heart of disloyalty. In these years, it seemed that Grand Secretary Zhang's disloyalty had been well controlled by him. But far away in Sangzhou, the Jing of Silla commanded tens of thousands of cavalrymen. After incorporating the old territory of the Luo state, the territory he ruled had already exceeded 1/3 of the Chu kingdom's territory. Who could control his disloyalty? In late autumn, the emperor of the Chu kingdom suddenly issued an imperial edict, which startled everyone. Every word of the emperor was an imperial edict, which was a very common thing. The problem was that the current emperor of the Chu kingdom was said to be an idiot who rarely spoke. As for the appointment and dismissal of officials, and the edicts that had to be issued during the annual sacrifices, it was said that they were drafted by the ministers and then sealed by Grand Secretary Zhang. Why would the emperor suddenly issue an imperial edict in person? What was even more surprising was the content of the imperial edict. Chapter 381. As soon as the imperial edict was issued, it immediately attracted a lot of discussion. Once Crown Prince Jing entered the capital, it would be difficult for him to leave. Did this mean that he was going to be a hostage? The problem was, how could Sangzhou agree? If they refused, would a civil war break out in the Chu kingdom? What was the emperor thinking? Or was this the idea of Grand Secretary Zhang and the ministers of the imperial court? Otherwise, how could the imperial edict be issued? Many people with conspiracy theories even thought of another possibility. Could it be that the idiotic emperor had really come to his senses and was no longer willing to be a puppet? Could it be that he wanted external help to ensure his own safety? Countless speculations fluttered in the sky above the capital like yellow leaves falling from a tree. As time went by, the coldness grew stronger. There was still no movement from Zhangzhou. The people became more and more uneasy, no matter how they looked at it. There was no reason for Crown Prince Jing to accept the imperial edict. Was this rare, prosperous era going to end because of that imperial edict? Thinking of this possibility, both the officials and the people felt hatred for the idiotic emperor in the palace. This was no imperial edict. It was a completely foolish order. Even Grand Secretary Zhang, who had allowed His Majesty to issue the imperial edict, was silently criticized. The first snow fell. The atmosphere in the capital of the Chu kingdom was unusually cold. The soldiers guarding the city rubbed their hands, praying that the idiotic emperor would die quickly and that everyone would quickly forget about the imperial edict. Suddenly, he saw a group of people coming from the plains outside the city. In the wind and snow, Crown Prince Jing arrived at the capital. The cold wind in the capital was replaced by warmth. Almost all the people crowded onto the sides of the street. Countless passionate and curious gazes fell on the car at the very front. The capital was far colder than Zhangzhou. Perhaps because of this, although Crown Prince Jing was weak, he still opened the window and leaned against it, smiling and waving at the people on the street. Crown Prince Jing was very famous in the Chu kingdom. Everyone knew that he was as beautiful as a flower, gentle, born intelligent, and extremely perfect. His only regret was that he was disabled and unable to walk. But because of this, he was even more loved. Looking at the prince through the window, the commoners on the street were extremely excited. Those women looked at the smile on his lips and were even more intoxicated, their legs touching each other. Someone said, "I heard that Her Majesty is also very beautiful, but her brain is not very good." These words attracted countless mockery and criticism. Crown Prince Jing had risked his life to come to the capital for the sake of peace in the Chu kingdom and for the sake of keeping the people away from the flames of war. How could that idiotic emperor compare to him? Then, many people thought of a terrible thing. Since His Majesty was an idiot, he must be muddle-headed and easily angered. Thinking of the imperial edict that allowed Crown Prince Jing to enter the capital, what if he really ordered someone to kill Crown Prince Jing? The conjecture spread quickly, and the crowds on both sides of the street were in an uproar. Some scholars waved their arms and led the crowd to the royal palace like a tide, requesting to see the grand scholar. They had to protect the life of the son of Chu kingdom. In the pavilion, Crown Prince Jing met the famous idiot emperor. Tong Yin had finally met Jingzhou. Even though Jingzhou was calm and intelligent, he couldn't help but feel sentimental after 20 years. Extrapolating from one place to another, it's indeed reasonable to experience the mortal world in the Guocheng Temple, he said. "Haven't you come here before?" asked Jingzhou. Tong Yin replied. Jingzhou said, "Bai Zhao should have been here before." Tong Yin shot him a baffled glance and said, "You weren't someone who liked to sow discord." Jingzhou said after some thought, "It's true that I'm not good at it." Tong Yin said, "We can only be ourselves. Even though we have come to the illusionary realm and lived here for 20 years, we are still ourselves." Jingzhou understood what she meant. What kind of person the participants of the Tao competition would be reincarnated into after coming to the illusionary realm had nothing to do with the green sky mirror, but with themselves. They would become the kind of person they wanted to be the most, the version of themselves in the deepest part of their memories. Then they would grow according to their own vision and the most important desire, until they succeeded or died. For instance, Bai Zhao had always regarded himself as the future leader of the Orthodox cultivation sections. As such, she was born as a princess, but she had to endure countless trials and hardships, and so did the others. Big Brother Bai is decisive in killing, which is why my master appreciates him a lot. But I didn't expect his willpower to be so strong, and it can be fully displayed here. Zhuo Rizhui wants to fight, which is why he became an assassin. Though he can't keep what he has cultivated here, I think he must have obtained the most benefits here. Tong Yin said, Hejan hates his good luck in the real world, so his luck here is very bad. What he remembers most is the betrayal of his friends. As such, he will continue to meet his friends here and experience the betrayal until he learns the same thing or overcomes it. Jingjiu listened in silence without uttering a word. Kane Yang wanted to play chess, so she was reincarnated as the son of the owner of the chess house. This also means that she must have suffered a lot in the mirror sect as a woman. Bai Zhao didn't reincarnate as a man because she was favored on the Cloud Dream Mountain and didn't suffer much. Tong Yin didn't want to think about the deepest reason. Jingjiu asked, what about you? Tong Yin said, according to my calculation, I will become a good prime minister or a military counselor in the future. Both a good prime minister and a military counselor played the role of an assistant. It was very clear who he would assist. Jingjiu's line of sight fell on the wheelchair. A woolen blanket covered Tong Yan's legs. In the real world, he was a young swordsman of the Zhongzhou school, a real young immortal. Why did he reincarnate as a cripple in the illusionary realm? It was because Bai Zhao was born weak and sickly. Jingjiu pitied her so much that he wanted to exchange his body for hers day and night. The word love was really harmful. Jingjiu thought about it in silence. Even someone as smart as Jingjiu couldn't avoid it. Tong Yin knew that Jingjiu had guessed something. He pulled up the blanket and said while looking at Jingjiu, the only thing I can't figure out is why you reincarnated as a prince of the Chu kingdom. Based on your temperament, this shouldn't have happened. So I'm really curious about your real identity in the real world. The Jing family of Zhaoga couldn't have raised a son like you. Jingjiu didn't answer Jingjiu's question directly, saying, nobody can predict everything that has happened to others, including you and me. Of the 26 participants, 7 were killed by Zhuo Ruzhui, and I killed 2. 17 are left. 9 of them are under my control and can be killed at any time. The remaining 7 are Shi Yun, Hejan, Zhuo Ruzhui, by Qianjun, young sister, you and him. Tong Yin continued after shooting a glance at the guard outside the pavilion. It's a bit weird that Shi Yun hasn't shown up yet. Zhuo Ruzhui's whereabouts are unpredictable, so it's hard to catch him. All I can do is try to control the 5 of you. Jingjiu said, if you can't control them, you have to try to kill them. You have sent 7 groups of people over the last few years. It's really annoying. He hadn't eaten anything since he was 15 years old. As for how to deceive those eunuchs and palace servant girls, Lu Shui would take care of it. And he had stayed in the deep part of the royal palace and had never left the palace gate. It was indeed not easy to kill him. Yet, Tong Yin didn't give up. He just didn't succeed. Jingjiu looked at the guard outside the pavilion again and said, I didn't expect him to be so strong and so patient. Jingjiu said, I know what you were going to do, so it's not hard to deal with it. Tong Yin said, but how can you be sure that I sent those people? Why can't it be Grand Secretary Zhang? Where does your trust in him come from? It has nothing to do with trust, said Jingjiu. It's just that if he wants to kill me, he will mobilize an army to attack me. He won't use a stingy method like sending assassins. You have a high opinion of him, said Tong Yin. Jingjiu said, he has helped me take care of many things. Why can't he send other participants of the Dao competition? Asked Tong Yin. Like by Qianjun or Hejan. Jingjiu said, I'm an idiot emperor. I'm not a threat to them. Tong Yin said, nobody thinks Jingjiu of Aoyama is an idiot. Jingjiu said, idiocy is the behavior of an idiot. In their eyes, my choice or path is wrong, so I'm an idiot. Tong Yin said, I don't think so, though I still can't figure out what path you have chosen. You think I'm the right one, so you want to kill me, said Jingjiu. Tong Yin said, I've always thought that you are the greatest competitor of my young sister, and that the others are not a threat to me. As such, I can only feel relieved if I kill you. You're right, said Jingjiu. After a moment of silence, Tong Yin said, "I hope you can give me a chance to prove that I'm wrong." By the edge of the green sky mirror, Xiang Wanshu and Cain Yang woke up one after another. After finding out what had happened, they showed a regretful expression on their faces, and then they found each other. "Thank you," said Cain Yang with a small smile. "Don't mention it," said Xiang Wanshu. Without further conversation, the two of them closed their eyes, starting to digest what they had learned in the illusionary realm. 2 days later, the two of them opened their eyes and smiled at each other. As Xiang Wanshu was about to say something, he suddenly heard some noises in the distance. They were in the deep part of the Huin Valley, and the near spectators were very far away, but they could still hear the noises. It was easy to imagine the uproar on the other side. Cain Yang felt a bit moved. She got up and dashed toward the outside of the valley. The rest of the participants were reluctant to leave, but Xiang Wanshu employed the escape method of heaven and earth to catch up with her after some thought. As they arrived outside the Huin Valley, Cain Yang and Xiang Wanshu couldn't help but feel bewildered when they saw the cultivation practitioners on the high platforms, especially some familiar yet strange faces. Yet, they were attracted by the scene in the sky before they could resolve their bewilderment. The heavenly retrieval orb, embedded in the green sky mirror, was like the sun in the illusionary realm. The scene projected by the orb in the sky was that world. The scene was round, like the window in a nunnery. There was a cold branch inside the round window, on which a blue bird was perched. The royal palace of the Chu kingdom was visible intermittently amid the wind and snow in the distance. A guard stood outside the pavilion, his clothes covered with snow. In the pavilion, Jingjiu and Tong Yin sat opposite each other in silence. A black go piece had been placed on the go board between them. Seeing this scene, Cain Yang covered her mouth with her hand to prevent herself from screaming, but her eyes were wet with tears. "I've started my vacation. The main reason is that I have to drink a lot during the 20-year reunion of my college classmates. Since it's the National Day, I'll take it easy." Chapter 382. Seeing the scene in the sky, there was an uproar outside the Huin Valley. Many people were as excited as Cain Yang. The Go playing was a necessary course for many cultivation practitioners, except for the people of the Aoyama sect. The most exciting Go game in the history of the cultivation world was, of course, the amazing game played by Jingjiu and Tong Yin at the plum meeting. Later, Tong Yin stayed behind closed doors, and Jingjiu's whereabouts were hard to find. Many people lamented that such a game of Go was impossible in the world. Nobody expected that Jingjiu and Tong Yin would meet again in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, and they would play another game of Go as the emperor of the Chu kingdom and the crown Prince Jing. Countless gazes were fixed on the sky, looking at the royal palace in the wind and snow, the small pavilion covered with snow, the Go board under the pavilion, and the two people sitting across from each other. The blue bird was sitting on the cold branch of the West Mountain, far away from the royal palace. She was well aware of what the people in the real world wanted to see, so she let the Go board fill up the whole scene. The lines on the Go board and the black Go piece with matte luster were very clear. Jingjiu reached out 2 fingers, picked up a white Go piece, and put on the Go board. His movement was very gentle, making no sound, but the people watching the game in the real world felt as if they had heard a thunder. Next, Tong Yin picked up a black Go piece with 3 fingers and put on the Go board casually. It was merely 3 Go pieces, so they were not very skillful, and their movements were simple and casual. But the spectators outside the Huin Valley felt that the trip was worthwhile. The Go game played by Jingjiu and Tong Yin was widely known both in the cultivation world and in the human world. All the details of what had happened on the chessboard mountain had been discussed many times. The people remembered clearly that Tong Yin had played the Go piece in the same way, and they also remembered the style of Jingjiu playing the Go pieces. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. Cain Yang stared at the scene in the sky with her arms folded in front of her chest, her eyes gleaming brightly without blinking. Seeing her nervous and expectant expression, Xiang Wanshu let out a faint smile. Cain Yang suddenly displayed a bewildered expression, asking, "What is going on?" Xiang Wanshu was startled, looking up at the sky. Following that, there were also many puzzled shouts. It was not that Jing Jiu made a strange move on the fourth move that no one could understand, but that the scene in the sky suddenly became abnormally blurry, and the chessboard was nowhere to be seen. The blue bird looked away, and the blurry image gradually became clear. It was a face. The man stood in front of the blue bird with a white cloth covering his mouth and nose. His eyes were exposed. His eyes were extremely bright, but they gave off a very listless feeling. Out of the way, Kane Yang didn't know who that person was, so she shouted anxiously. Many people outside the Huin Valley also shouted subconsciously. It never occurred to them that the person could hear the voices outside. Those angry shouts and even curses gradually subsided, turning into an uproar and commotion because someone recognized that person's identity. The man covered by the white cloth was the most formidable assassin in the illusionary realm of the Green Sky Mirror, but he was a little monster of the Aoyama sect in the real world. Why did Zhuo Ruzhui show up in the capital of the Chu Kingdom? Moreover, Jing Jiu and Tong Yin were in the royal palace, but why did he show up on the West Mountain and stand in front of the blue bird? The snow fell down noiselessly, and the West Mountain grew colder. Standing in the snow, Zhuo Ruzhui looked at the blue bird on the tree branch, saying nothing. Blocked by Jing Jiu, the blue bird couldn't show the go pieces in the pavilion to the people in the real world. Yet, Kane Yang and the other cultivation practitioners didn't say anything. It was because they all guessed that Jing Jiu must have his intention. He stood very close to the blue bird, so his eyes could be seen clearly. They were so calm that it was frightening. Looking at the pair of eyes in the sky, Kane Yang suddenly thought of a possibility, her expression changing slightly. In the next moment, many people, including Xiang Wanshu, thought of another possibility. It was deathly quiet outside the Huin Valley, even quieter than the snow-falling West Mountain. Jing Jiu ordered Tong Yin to come to the capital, and Zhuo Ruzhui suddenly showed up. It was most likely an agreement between them. They intended to join hands to kill Tong Yin. Tong Yin was the most intelligent and outstanding participant in the Dao competition at Zhongzhou School. If they could kill him, it would be a good thing for the Aoyama sect to compete for the Fairy Book of Longevity. Zhuo Ruzhui had tried to do so by the Cangzhou Lake back then. However, Jing Jiu had been living like an idiot since he entered the illusionary realm. Why would he suddenly make such a drastic change? If this was a scheme set up by the Aoyama sect to kill Tong Yin, Zhuo Ruzhui had to come here to keep an eye on the blue bird, or at least get some kind of promise from her. The blue bird was the spirit of the Green Sky Mirror. If she wanted to help her disciple in secret, Jing Jiu and Zhuo Ruzhui wouldn't be able to kill Tong Yin, no matter how formidable they were. You didn't do it last time. I think it's Jing Jiu's idea. I won't interfere in the Dao competition. All I want to do is to remind you that if you want to kill someone, you should be prepared to be killed. Having said that, the blue bird left the tree branch and flew toward the royal palace. The people outside the Huin Valley all heard this. This was the promise made by the Zhongzhou school. Zhuo Ruzhui disappeared in the wind and snow. The scenes in the sky changed constantly as the blue bird flew. All the details in the capital of the Chu Kingdom and the royal palace could be seen clearly. The suppressed screams of surprise broke out outside the Huin Valley. Those highly achieved swordsmen who disguised themselves as the populace, but had weapons on them, were probably the men of sacrifice trained by Cangzhou. Whose order would those royal guards of the Chu Kingdom listen to in the end? As the blue bird said, Tong Yin must have a strong backing since he dared to come to the capital. Did he intend to win this game as well? Kane Yang clenched her hands tighter in front of her chest. She didn't feel nervous or excited this time, but rather worried. The game of Go in the pavilion turned out to be so dangerous. The scene in the sky suddenly became a vast expanse of white. It was the square in the royal palace, covered with a layer of snow. A person stood on it. That person was dressed in black and standing in the snow. He was exceptionally eye-catching. He was Duke Missouri. He was the most powerful person in this world. Unexpectedly, Duke Missouri came to the capital with the crown Prince Jing. Did he come here to kill the emperor? Duke Missouri suddenly lifted his head to look at the sky. All the people in the real world saw his eyes. The cultivation practitioners had never cared about these people in the illusionary realm. They didn't even regard them as real living beings. Duke Missouri was the most powerful swordsman in the illusionary realm, but he was merely in the early stage of a yuanying state. But the people outside the Huin Valley felt a strong sense of uneasiness when they saw his eyes, as if they had been seen through by him. The blue bird also saw Duke Mo's eyes. It landed on the snow tiles on the roof of the Grand Hall, took a deep look at this person, and then turned to the pavilion. The game of Go in the pavilion had been going on for a while. Over 20 Go pieces were placed on the board, scattered all over the place. They seemed to be in a mess, without any order or contact. Jingjio suddenly looked in the direction of the wind and snow. Tong Yin also looked in that direction and asked with raised eyebrows, "Someone is breaking through the state?" Jingjio said, "He's breaking through the state." Chapter 383. Duke Missouri was the swordsman with the highest cultivation state in this world. This fact was so clear that it could be easily seen when Jing Jio stood in the snow-covered royal palace in a black cloth. Normally, he shouldn't be standing here, but he was standing here, and nobody dared to question him. Some paw prints were left on the snowy ground, which were the traces left by the blue bird flying in the sky. Duke Missouri stopped looking at the sky and looked at the paw prints thoughtfully. In the duty room outside the royal palace, the Grand Secretary Zhang was also deep in thought while looking at the cooling tea in the teacup. An official stood in front of him, looking a bit nervous. The commander of the royal army pushed open the door and walked in with Shueli. He said gravely, "The people of Sangzhou are keeping an eye on them, but I'm worried that those men of sacrifice might have sneaked into the royal palace in advance, and those commoners and scholars gathered outside the royal palace. If we don't disperse them as soon as possible, they might be used by someone with ulterior motives." The Grand Secretary pushed the teacup away from the edge of the table with his forefinger and said, "If something happens in the royal palace, the royal army should take action." Upon hearing this, the official's expression changed drastically. He knelt down in front of the Grand Secretary and said hastily, "Sir, you mustn't do that." The Grand Secretary stared at this person, saying nothing. The official said in a hoarse voice, "His Majesty summoned Crown Prince Jing to the capital indiscriminately. The situation in the imperial court has become unstable, and the public opinion is in turmoil. How can we miss such a good opportunity?" Though he didn't say it clearly, the meaning was clear. Whether the emperor wanted to kill Crown Prince Jing or Crown Prince Jing wanted to kill the emperor, the imperial court could take advantage of the chaos to do many things, and they didn't have to bear any responsibility afterward. This was the best opportunity for the Grand Secretary, or even the perfect one. Even the commander of the royal army was hesitant. He looked at the Grand Secretary, waiting for his final decision nervously. Seeing that the Grand Secretary Zhang remained silent, the official had some hope. He tried to persuade the Grand Secretary again. Even if His Majesty is prepared, Duke Missouri is in the royal palace. As long as he takes action, what can't be solved? Brother Mo has always done things for the sake of the world. Why would he act for our selfishness? Grand Secretary Zhang got up and walked to the window. He looked into the depths of the imperial palace and thought of the friend he had known for decades. He fell silent again. With Crown Prince Jing's intelligence and ability, since he was able to bring Duke Missouri into the palace, he would naturally be able to persuade Duke Missouri to help. Today's opportunity was indeed too good. No matter how wise His Majesty was and how unfathomable he was, there was no way he could resist this snowstorm. But why did he still feel that something was wrong? His gaze pierced through the palace walls and snow, and he seemed to see the image of Duke Missouri standing in the snow. He felt that something very important was happening there. Master Mo stood in the wind and snow, and many others stood in the wind and snow. The common people and scholars gathered outside the royal palace were crying and shouting in the snow, begging His Majesty to ensure the safety of Crown Prince Jing so that the Chu kingdom would not fall into the terrible flames of war. For example, the cavalrymen who were waiting in the back streets, and the Zhangzhou experts who were ready to break into the royal palace. Not far from the main hall, several eunuchs who had castrated themselves 10 years ago were wearing feather robes. They were quietly approaching under the cover of the wind and snow. Other than Tong Yin and themselves, no one knew that they were death soldiers sent to the royal palace by Zhangzhou. The events and people happening in the capital of the Chu kingdom today were like the paw prints that the blue bird had deliberately left in the snow. They were scattered here and there, seemingly unrelated, but in fact, they had an extremely secret and mysterious connection. What would happen in the end, and whether these people would live or die, all depended on the end of the game of chess. But the game of chess was currently suspended. Looking at the wind and snow in the distance, Tong Yin raised his thick eyebrows like swords. This was the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, not the real world. The cultivation practitioners here couldn't ascend, so why would there be a heavenly punishment? Then he recalled the statement he had heard many years ago when he first came to this world. The highest cultivation state in this world was the upper state of the golden pill or the initial state of the free travel. It was impossible to advance any further. Was it because someone in this world had reached the cultivation state above the initial state of the free travel that the signs of the heavenly punishment appeared? This kind of thing should have happened in the green sky mirror before. The cultivation practitioners here were not real lives, so they must have been wiped out. But this time, Tong Yin sensed the change of energy in the wind and snow. Feeling a bit complicated, it was because he knew who the person who was about to break through the heavenly punishment was. Duke Missouri was a great scholar and a great calligrapher, and he was the cultivation practitioner with the highest cultivation state in the last few hundred years. He was a good friend of Tong Yin and a close friend of Grand Secretary Zhang. He came to the capital of the Chu kingdom that day not to kill the emperor, but for the peace of the world. As Grand Secretary Zhang thought, since Tong Yin could persuade him to come to the capital, he must have a way to persuade him to attack Jingjiu. Yet, Tong Yin was hesitant at the moment. If Duke Missouri chose to break through the heavenly punishment, he would die both physically and spiritually, which would have a fatal effect on his plan. It seemed that he should find a way to persuade Duke Missouri not to face the heavenly punishment, no matter from Duke Mo's point of view or his own. However, Tong Yin was a cultivation practitioner, so he was well aware of the feeling of approaching the path toward heaven. As the saying goes, one can die in the evening if one understands the path in the morning. He didn't want Duke Missouri to miss this opportunity because of him. What will you choose? Tong Yin suddenly asked Jingjiu. He wasn't asking about his next move, but about Duke Mo's choice. Jingjiu glanced at him, but didn't say anything. In his view, this was not a matter that needed to be chosen. Life should always move in that direction. The snowstorm grew stronger, and the scene in the imperial palace grew more and more blurry. Time passed slowly. Duke Missouri stood in the snow, still not moving. Jingjiu moved. He picked up a black go piece and placed it on the board. Crack! A thick bolt of lightning suddenly fell from the sky, piercing through the snow and striking the imperial palace. Countless cries of alarm rang out inside and outside the imperial palace. Tong Yin's body became somewhat stiff. He didn't know if this was a coincidence or something else. Jingjiu said, "Let's go take a look." Lu Shisui glanced at Tong Yin and walked out of the palace gate with his umbrella to the square of the imperial palace. The decree to seal the imperial palace had been issued. Even though the heavenly thunder had fallen and the outside of the imperial palace was in chaos, no one came in. A hole appeared on the white carpet like snow, as if it had been burned by a lamp. Several cracks appeared in the surroundings. The edges of Duke Mo's clothes were somewhat scorched. He looked at the sky in silence. There was no fear in his eyes, only the will to fight. His right hand had already landed on his sword. Lu Shisui looked at him in silence, waiting for him to make the final decision. The bluebird flew out of the snow and landed lightly on the table. It didn't look at Duke, Missouri in the snow. So the cultivation practitioners in the real world outside the Huin Valley didn't see the heavenly thunder. Chapter 384. The blue bird looked at Jingjiao. Jingjiao said, "Don't look at me. It has nothing to do with me." Tong Yin looked at the blue bird. The blue bird said in the human language, "Don't look at me. It has nothing to do with me." Hearing this, even Jingjiao looked at the blue bird. This was the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. Everything had something to do with her. The blue bird said, "I'm the mirror spirit, not the rule." This statement had a deeper meaning, but she didn't explain it. She left it to Jingjiao and Tong Yin to ponder over. Jingjiao didn't express his opinion on this matter. "Continue," he said to Tong Yin. It was Duke Mo's choice whether to break through or pass the heavenly tribulation, or to face it or give up. When Jingjiao placed the black go piece on the board, a flash of lightning struck down from the sky. It was Tong Yin's turn now. Looking at the deep end of the wind and snow, Tong Yin fell silent for a while. Then she picked up a white go piece with 3 of her fingers and placed it on the board. The blue bird walked to the board and pulled the white go piece with his right claw to adjust its position. "Why are you still as stupid as when you were little?" he complained. Tong Yin retorted expressionlessly, "If I'm stupid, what are you then?" It was evident that Tong Yin and the blue bird had known each other before, and they were quite familiar with each other. Jingjiao didn't mind it. He picked up a black go piece and placed it on the board. Tong Yin placed the go piece on the board. Jingjiao placed it on the board again. His 2 hands kept on placing the go pieces. The number of go pieces on the board increased gradually. The blue bird walked among the go pieces. His steps were light, as if he was dancing. It was a wonderful scene. Yet, the cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley and in the real world couldn't see it. They couldn't see the wind and snow falling in the royal palace and the lightning striking down from time to time. All they could see was what the blue bird could see. It was evident that the blue bird did this on purpose. She didn't want the outsiders, especially Bai Zhenren, to know that Duke Missouri had encountered the heavenly tribulation. The cultivation practitioners in the real world were well aware that the situation in the capital of the Chu Kingdom was very tense. Yet they had seen all the changes in the world in the green sky mirror over the last 10 days, such as the changes of the sea and the changing royal flags on the top of the city walls. As such, these events couldn't affect their mood. All they wanted to do was watch the game of Go. Occasionally, they would hear a low and oppressive rumble coming from the depths of the image, which made them a little curious. Why would there be thunder in such a windy and snowy day? This Go game between Jingjiao and Tong Yin was different from the one on the chessboard mountain. That game of chess was called the heaven-shocking game because both sides were filled with killing intent on the chessboard. Every time a chess piece was placed, heaven and earth would respond. Wind blew, rain fell, and thunder and lightning intersected. That Go game was called the shocking game because the 2 of them were full of lethal intent on the Go pieces. Every time a Go piece was played, heaven and earth would respond to it, and the wind would rise and the rain would fall, as well as the lightning and thunder. Nobody could tell what the water tasted like, and few people could appreciate the beauty of this Go game. Jingjiao and Tong Yin played their Go pieces casually. The people outside the Huin Valley were bewildered, unable to understand what they were playing. Cain Yang was the only one who stared at the scene in the sky, her face blushing slightly and her body swaying slightly, as if she had drunk some strong alcohol. A moment later, her face grew pale, as if she had drunk too much alcohol and wanted to vomit. She had won first place in the chess tournaments of the Plum Meeting several times in a row, and was recognized as the best chess player. She was the only one who could understand the Go game played by Jingjiao and Tong Yin. To her surprise, she found that Jingjiao and Tong Yin's Go skills were much better than before. Xiang Wanshu let out a bitter smile, thinking that he knew the Go game very well, but he could only judge the current situation from Cain Yang's reaction. It was really ridiculous. Many cultivation practitioners had also come to their senses. After Jingjiao and Tong Yin played their Go pieces, They stopped thinking hard and looked at Kane Yang immediately. Outside the Huin Valley, countless heads were seen moving back and forth between Kane Yang and the sky. The scene was similar to the chess tournament of the Plum meeting, but it was more amusing and funny. The Go game in the pavilion had entered the middle stage, and Kane Yang's reaction became less and less. It was hard for people to judge the situation from her facial expressions. She stared at the scene in the sky with her nose slightly opened, showing that she was extremely nervous. Her face turned from pale to red, and the expression in her eyes changed from bewilderment to determination. Those eunuchs were still waiting for the news. The men of sacrifice from Sangzhou outside the palace, and the spies in the crowd were also waiting for the news. The royal palace was tightly guarded, and nobody was in sight. In the wind and snow, Lu Shui held an umbrella while looking at Duke Missouri in the square. He didn't know what the emperor wanted him to see, but since he was the only one in the royal palace, he decided to come and have a look. The man in black was indeed very powerful, and his cultivation state was unfathomable. If he wanted to harm the emperor, Jingzhou wouldn't be able to stop him, and he would be killed in 2 moves. The question was, what was he doing standing in the snow? Was he an idiot? Lu Shui couldn't help but sympathize with this man when he thought that he had forgotten many things and could be considered an idiot. Duke Missouri was of course not an idiot. He was the swordsman with the highest cultivation state in this world, and also the wisest and most benevolent person in this world. Wisdom was a good thing, and so was benevolence, but sometimes it was very difficult to make a choice when both of them were present. Duke Missouri was faced with such a choice, which was why he had remained silent for a long time. He came to the royal palace of the Chu kingdom that day at the invitation of Crown Prince Jing, and he also wanted to help Xiaoqiu. The situation of the world had been stabilized, and Qin, Zhao, and Chu were the most powerful states. If these 3 states could maintain the current balance of power, it would be difficult for wars to start again, and millions of people would be able to live in peace. He didn't need to worry about the Qin kingdom and Zhao, and the ruthless crown prince and the gloomy and terrifying Zhuqiansui wouldn't make any mistakes. Only the idiotic emperor of the Chu kingdom made him feel somewhat uneasy. He worried that the emperor of the Chu kingdom wasn't really an idiot. Sure enough, when the imperial court of the Chu kingdom was at its most stable, the idiotic emperor suddenly issued an edict for Crown Prince Jing to enter the capital. Did he want to take advantage of the chaos to regain power at the risk of a civil war? Such a method could be said to be extremely bold and crazy. How can an idiot do it? Therefore, he came covered in wind and snow, intending to kill the emperor for the sake of the world. Who would have thought that at this most critical moment, he would suddenly understand a trace of heaven's secret? At that time, the blue bird flew across the sky, leaving messy paw prints in his heart and on the snow. He looked up at the sky and vaguely saw another world. This gray, snowy sky didn't seem real. It seemed that could be cut open with a sword. Just as this thought came to Duke Mo's mind, thunder began to fall from the snowy sky. He was now faced with a choice: draw the sword to the sky, or turn around and kill the emperor. He knew that in the snow pavilion on the side of the palace, not far away, the emperor and Crown Prince Jing were playing chess. Thunder and lightning fell incessantly from the snowy sky, and the loud rumbling was incessant. Some of the lightning were like pillars, and some were like threads falling all around him. The snow melted, and the exposed blue stones were scorched black everywhere. Stone chips burst out, and cracks appeared. Duke Missouri held the hilt of his sword, and his eyes gradually filled with determination. Seeing this scene, Lu Shui didn't stay any longer. He turned around and left. The chess game in the snow pavilion had entered its final stage. Lu Shui returned to the pavilion with an umbrella and shook his head at Jingzhou. The wind and snow suddenly disappeared, and thunder and lightning stopped. Jingzhou was silent for a while. He picked up a chess piece and put on the chessboard, saying, "I won." The snow palace was silent. It was the same outside the Huin Valley. Tong Yin looked at him in silence. She didn't see any joy in his eyes, only tiredness and regret. It was rare for Jingjiu to have such an emotion. Why was he tired? And for whom was he regretting? His shoes squeaked in the deep snow. Duke Missouri walked through the palace gate. Tong Yin sat in her wheelchair, silent. No one knew what she was thinking. Jingjiu looked at the chessboard and said something. Everyone knew that he said this to Duke Missouri. When you look back on the past later, I hope you won't regret your choice. Chapter 385. I mixed up the colors of Jingjiu's and Tong Yan's chess pieces. The manuscript has been changed. I didn't want to wash out the contents of this chapter, so I left it there. I bought it everyone. Duke Mo understood Jingjiu's meaning and said, "Our paths are different." The path was right in front of him, but he couldn't take that step in the end. That was because he cared about the world. This was a sacrifice he was willing to make. Jingjiu didn't object to this, but he felt a bit regretful. But for Duke Missouri, the fact that Jingjiu could see that he was only one step away from the path of heaven meant that there was a problem. It was the problem that he had been worried about all this time. This famous idiot emperor was definitely not an idiot. When Xiaoqiu told me about your majesty, I felt that he was being vague. Now that I think about it, he already knew that your majesty was a true genius. Duke Missouri looked at Jingjiu and sighed. But for the sake of the people, I must ask your majesty to die today. The world is important, the country is light, and the emperor is even lighter, so you can die. These words seemed indifferent, but they were like thunder. They were words that were qualified to be written in the history books. Jingjiu didn't react, as if he hadn't heard it. Lu Shui was the same. Tong Yin suddenly felt that something was wrong. Everything was going according to his plan. Even if Grand Secretary Zhang didn't want to become emperor, he still needed time and energy to quell the frenzy within the bureaucracy. Moreover, Sangzhou had prepared many things for the imperial court to do. With Duke Missouri in the palace, Jingjiu had no chance of survival. How could he still be so calm? Tong Yan's gaze fell on the chessboard. He suddenly saw the meaning of life and death. His right hand unconsciously tightened around the armrest of his wheelchair. He suddenly raised his head and stared at Jingjiu. "This is impossible," Jingjiu said. "Nothing is impossible." Tong Yin was silent for a while, then said, "Since you wanted to kill me from the beginning, I think Zhuo Ruzhui should have arrived by now." Jingjiu said, "Yes, I don't know where he is either." Tong Yin said, "The fact that Zhuo Ruzhui is willing to listen to your arrangements means that he hasn't forgotten about the past." He hasn't either. Aoima's sect is truly amazing. He had vaguely guessed the identity of the guard of the No Mercy sect, but he didn't have any proof. Forgetting is not because of the mortal world, but the power of time. Jingjiu said, "If you can't transcend time, you will forever be the slave of time. The disciples of Aoyama can't be slaves." Hearing this, Duke Missouri looked pensive and said, "The so-called wishes are also shackles. They should be taken off like clothes." Jingjiu said, "That's true." Looking at the pavilion, Duke Missouri found that he couldn't figure out the cultivation level of this young emperor. He suddenly said, "If so, why do you insist on it? Maybe we can have a better ending today." No sooner had he finished saying this than Jingjiu disappeared from the original spot along with the cold wind. In the next moment, he arrived in the pavilion, his hands landing on the wheelchair of Tong Yin. Seeing this, Lu Shui's expression changed slightly, and he put down the umbrella in his hand slowly. Jingjiu's cultivation state was too high. If Jingjiu had attacked the emperor earlier, Jingjiu wouldn't have been able to stop him. Duke Missouri pushed Tong Yan's wheelchair toward the gate of the palace. The wheels of the wheelchair gave off a squeaky sound as they rolled over the accumulated snow, which was not unpleasant to hear. "You people can give up on killing me, but I won't." Jingjiu's calm voice rang out in the pavilion. Duke Missouri halted his steps. Tong Yin arched her eyebrows and said, "The Grand Scholar won't let you kill me. He is someone who wants to leave his name in the history books, so he will care about how this day is recorded in the history books." "I don't care about it," said Jingjiu. Jingjiu didn't care about what was recorded in the history books, what the Grand Scholar thought, or anything else. A few thudding noises suddenly burst out outside the palace gate, along with the sounds of fighting. The eunuchs who had been placed in the royal palace by Tsangzhou for more than 10 years were lying on the ground, stained with red snow. Along with the rapid footsteps, a great many guards and royal guards surrounded the grand hall, and then someone knocked on the door. "Your Majesty, the situation outside the palace has been pacified. Please calm down. Please allow me to persuade Duke Missouri to leave." The old and anxious voice of Grand Secretary Zhang came in from outside the palace gate. Duke Missouri turned his head around and looked at Jingjio in the pavilion. Jingjio didn't say anything. Grand Secretary Zhang yelled again outside the palace gate. "Your Majesty, please reconsider. Duke Missouri, please reconsider." Looking at the palace gate not far away, Duke Missouri said, "He won't let you kill me, and you can't kill me either. If I die, Jing of Silla will lead the army to the Qin kingdom, and the resources and strength I have prepared here for 20 years will all be handed over to Bai Qianjun. By then, nobody in the world will be able to stop him, and you will have no choice but to admit defeat." "Like I said, I don't care," said Jingjio. Tong Yin said, "Even if you win the chess game and kill me, what's the use? Won't I win the chess game in the end?" "You underestimate your own importance," said Jingjio. "The final outcome of this Dao competition will be decided by you and me, right under the pavilion, not in the world." After a long moment of silence, Tong Yin said, "Even I feel proud to be evaluated in such a way by you, but I don't understand why you value me so much." "You understand." Even if you didn't understand it before, you should understand it now. Otherwise, why would you give up such a good opportunity and hint to Duke Missouri to take you away? "And this is why I have to kill you," said Jingjio. Tong Yin was silent. Yes, it was his idea to make Duke Missouri give up the idea of killing the emperor because he had guessed something shocking and he had to tell his younger sister about it. Otherwise, this Dao competition might have an unimaginable ending. Unfortunately, he gave up the opportunity to kill Jingjio so decisively. But Jingjio didn't want him to leave. Looking at the palace gate not far away, Tong Yin raised her eyebrows and asked, "Are you sure you can kill me?" Jingjio was in the pavilion, Lu Shui was by the pavilion, and Zhuoruzhui was nowhere to be found. Sitting in the wheelchair pushed by Duke Missouri, Jingjio was only a few steps away from the palace gate, and he could leave at any time. Duke Missouri was the strongest swordsman in this world. No matter how talented the disciples of Aoyama were, they couldn't be his match, even if they had been cultivating since they were born in their mother's wombs for no more than 20 years. Tong Yin thought to himself, "Even if you can kill me, you will die for sure." Yes, this was the final outcome. The snowfall had stopped a while ago. The cold wind whistled, blowing away the leaden clouds. The beautiful and cold sunlight shone on the royal palace. The sounds of fighting and chaos could be vaguely heard outside the royal palace. The anxious voice of the grand scholar could be heard outside the palace gate, but it seemed to come from a distant place. It was quiet around the pavilion. It was deathly quiet in the real world as well. The cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley looked at the scene in the sky nervously, waiting for the first face-to-face confrontation between the Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school in the Dao competition. "I'm leaving," said Tong Yin. His voice was calm, and his tone was steady, like a guest bidding farewell to his host. "Kill him," said Jingjio. The shadow outside the palace gate changed slightly, and a person leapt out from it, slashing at Tong Yin on the wheelchair with a formidable and lethal intent. The remaining snow was the white cloth he wore on his face, and the shadow was his body. It turned out that Zhuoruzhui had been waiting here the entire time. From the very beginning, Jingjio had no intention of letting Tong Yin leave here alive. Tong Yin took out a gun from his sleeve with an indifferent expression on his face and pulled the trigger without hesitation. Meanwhile, he crushed a talisman treasure with his left hand. He had been watching the palace gate for a long time and had prepared for it for a long time. It seemed that Duke Missouri had full confidence in the weak crown Prince Jing. He didn't heed Zhuoruzhui, and disappeared from behind the wheelchair. As he reappeared, he was already in the pavilion. Along with a dragon cry, the famous sword was unsheathed. The cold sword turned into a beam of light and pierced forward. Jingjio didn't move. He didn't know when Lu Shui had appeared in front of him. The cold sword pierced through his chest, and only half of it was left outside. Lu Shui didn't give Duke Missouri a chance to pull out his sword. His hands fell down like iron, holding the sword tightly. What he used was not the lock of autumn, but the inherited heaven's swordsmanship. Blood seeped out from between his palms and the blade. He knew that he was no match for Duke Missouri, so he didn't want to fight. He just wanted to stop his opponent's sword for a moment. Both of them had chosen the same strategy, which was to use their weakest member to lock the strongest member of their opponent. It all depended on how long Tong Yin could withstand Zhuo Rujui's crazy attacks, and whether Lu Shui could lock Duke Mo's sword. Duke Missouri felt a strange power coming from the young guard's hands, as if it had become a real scabbard. He raised his eyebrows slightly. If he couldn't pull out his sword, then he would move forward. Duke Missouri let out a clear whistle and stepped forward. The cold sword sank into Lu Shui's body and came out through his back, heading straight for Jingjio under the pavilion. Lu Shui was bleeding profusely, and he kept retreating. It was a light crack. The cold sword pierced into the pavilion pillar. Jingjio wasn't there. With a crack, the pavilion collapsed. Duke Missouri looked back in surprise. Outside the palace, the roar had not stopped, and the pungent smell of burnt flesh was spreading. In the blurry smoke, blood could be seen splattering like a waterfall. The combination of the gun and the talisman could produce a great power. Tong Yin was born with a weak body and couldn't go far on the road to cultivation. So she made a lot of preparations in this area. She managed to break one of Zhuo Rujui's arms with one blow. This still couldn't stop Zhuo Rujui from killing him, but at least it bought him some time. As long as Duke Missouri could kill Jingjio and Lu Shui, he could turn around and help him out. Unfortunately, there was no chance. There was a delicate palm print on the back of the wheelchair. The palm print penetrated the steel material and directly imprinted on Tong Yan's back. Blood splattered like a waterfall, not only from Zhuo Rujui's broken arm, but also from Tong Yan's lips. This was, of course, Jingjio's attack. The question was, how did he get there from the pavilion? What was even more puzzling was, where did he go? Duke Missouri suddenly felt a little cold, and then very cold, as if countless cold winds were curling around his body and mind. He looked at his body and found that there were hundreds of tiny holes on his body, and blood was seeping out. These bloody holes were very small. Even a grain of snow couldn't get in, but the cold wind could. His flesh and blood gradually filled up the small holes, but the damage could no longer be healed. His jinqi scattered into heaven and earth like silk, and so did his vitality. Duke Missouri looked at the gradually disappearing bloody holes and was puzzled. The Emperor's state was indeed extraordinary, but not higher than his. The cold wind rose again. Jingjio reappeared in the snow, his face pale. Chapter 386. The participants in the Dao competition in the illusionary realm of the Green Sky Mirror were actually their spiritual souls, and so was Jingjio. Without a physical body and only a spiritual soul, his underworld fairy sword could travel at an unimaginable speed. Even the swordsman in the Yuanying state couldn't resist it. Jingjio didn't respond to Duke Mo's question, but replied to Jun Yuan in silence. Duke Missouri walked toward the snowy ground after leaving the ruins. The numerous holes on his body opened up again, shooting out countless bloody arrows. It seemed that he didn't feel anything at all. He didn't stop until he came before Jingjio. He sensed the loss of his vitality and the disappearance of the mysterious energy in the sky. Thinking of what Jingjio had said earlier, he couldn't help but feel a bit frustrated. This frustration was not regret. It was because he wanted to do two things at the same time. He wanted to see the scene in the sky and hoped that the human race would have a bright future. Yet, He felt a bit regretful that these two things happened at the same time, so he had no choice but to make a choice. In the end, he didn't draw out his sword. It could be said that he had missed the opportunity. Of course, it was also because he had an instinctive fear of the sky. Duke Missouri said to Jingjio, "Unfortunately, we can only choose once." "Yes," said Jingjio. "It's a pity." Duke Missouri didn't say anything more. He sat down slowly on the snowy ground and wiped off the blood beads on his face with his sleeve. Then, he closed his eyes and bid farewell to Jingjio. The wind and snow had stopped, and everything was quiet. Zhuoruzhui sealed the bleeding wound on his broken arm and turned the wheelchair around. Tong Yan's face was pale, and she was breathing rapidly. Her thick eyebrows were raised high, indicating that she was puzzled. "What are you afraid that I will figure out?" she asked Jingjio. Jingjio said, "You have guessed it, but I won't admit it. So don't say anything more. Die now." A regretful expression showed in Tong Yan's eyes. Then, she let out a smile and tilted her head to one side. She breathed her last. Lu Shui sat up in the ruins with difficulty. "It hurts a bit," he said while panting. The bloody hole in his chest was extremely large and looked extremely terrifying. One could imagine the pain he was in. Duke Missouri was too powerful. If he had not used such a bloody method to lock the sword, the Netherworld Fairy Sword would not have been able to kill him so easily. Jingjio said, "Don't be stubborn. Let's go." He was the emperor of the Chu Kingdom, but he had killed Crown Prince Jing in the imperial palace after receiving an imperial edict, which would inevitably cause a great disturbance. As his personal bodyguard, Lu Shui had to die in the end. Lu Shui drew his sword and placed it across his neck. Just as he was about to exert force, he suddenly remembered something and asked, "Your Majesty, what exactly is our relationship?" Jingjio said, "You'll know when you get out." Lu Shui said, "Then I'll go first." Jingjio said, "Wait for me outside. Don't go far." "Okay," Lu Shui said, and then he tightened his grip slightly and committed suicide. Though Zhuoruzhui was severely wounded, his life was not in danger. As a famous assassin in the illusionary realm, he must have a way to escape from the royal palace. Before he left, he asked Jingjio a question. "What's so strange about your sword?" He was referring to the fight between them in the valley where Baizeo cultivated before they entered the illusionary realm. Zhuoruzhui found it strange at the time that Jingjio's sword looked ordinary, but every time they met, his sword source would stagnate a bit. That iron sword was very strange. Jingjio knew what he was asking about, saying, "My sword is poisonous." Thinking of Jingjio's usual behavior, Zhuoruzhui shrugged and said, "Senior Master, I think it's you who is poisonous." The quietness inside the palace gate brought unimaginable anxiety to the people outside. The Grand Scholar couldn't wait any longer. Boom! The palace gate was knocked open by the heavy wood of the royal guards. The Grand Scholar waved his sleeve to dissuade the people around him and entered the palace first. Seeing the scene in front of him, the expression on his face changed abruptly. He turned around and ordered all the people to back off and not to enter the palace without permission. The chancellors and the royal guards followed the order and backed off. They used the cloth curtain to block the sight of the people inside and outside the palace. The Grand Scholar didn't turn around until all this was done. Seeing the blood on the snowy ground and the horrible scene, his face turned pale and his body swayed slightly. "Why did they do this?" he murmured. Duke Missouri sat on the ground, covered in blood, his eyes closed. He was dead. Crown Prince Jing sat in the wheelchair, his head tilted to one side. He was no longer breathing. The thin and dark bodyguard who had been following the emperor was also dead. There was a large bloody hole in his chest and a bloody line on his throat. The Grand Scholar walked to the front of Jingjio. It took a great deal of effort for him to walk such a short distance. The wrinkles on his face deepened, as if he had aged a few years. Jingjio said nonchalantly, "Crown Prince Jing colluded with Duke Missouri to assassinate me, and he died together with this bodyguard." The Grand Scholar knew that this was not the truth, and that the emperor was merely giving him an explanation. "Your Majesty, why did you do this?" he asked with a bitter smile. Jing Jio said, "Crown Prince Jing had guessed some of my thoughts, so he had to die." The Grand Scholar said painfully, once this matter was exposed, the Jing of Silla would either surrender to the Zhao Kingdom or the Qin Kingdom, or even rebel. The Chu Kingdom would have a hard time conquering the world. "Doesn't your Majesty care about this?" Jing Jio said, "You should know what those scholars and commoners who were making trouble outside the royal palace were thinking. It's normal for them to avoid the war, but it's impossible for them to conquer the world with the help of the Chu people. The Chu Kingdom had been peaceful for a long time, and its people were gentle and reserved. All they wanted was to be well protected, to prevent them from suffering, to prevent them from wandering around, and to prevent them from having no one to rely on. This kind of people was only suitable to be people. Nothing else was suitable. All these can be changed as long as we have enough time." The Grand Scholar looked at Jing Jio and said earnestly, "Though I'm old, your Majesty is still young." Jing Jio said, "I can only change some people around me, but I can't and don't want to change all the people in the world. It's too tiring and troublesome." The assassination in the snowy palace and the chaos in the capital had to be dealt with. The Grand Secretary Zhang left the royal palace in a hurry, despite his tiredness. He didn't forget to instruct people to clean up the blood and corpses in the snow, just like how Jing Jio was assassinated many years ago in the morning. The chaos outside the royal palace and the assassination and arson in the capital had all been suppressed. The city was filled with cries and curses. Those scholars and populace who were worried about the safety of the Crown Prince Jing were expelled by the royal army. They spread many rumors about Jing Jio, which were unfavorable to him. For instance, the thunder and lightning in the snowy sky must be the result of the dissatisfaction of the emperor. Many chancellors advised the Grand Scholar not to be so forceful, and a dozen of them wanted to take advantage of the situation to force the emperor to abdicate the throne. The Grand Scholar was enraged and had all these people imprisoned. At dusk, the Grand Scholar entered the royal palace again to meet the emperor. He reported the situation in the imperial court and the reaction of Tsangzhou in detail. The Crown Prince Jing came to the royal palace with the intention of killing the emperor. The problem was that he was dead now, and the emperor was still alive. As such, nobody believed what the imperial court said. In order to appease the people, the imperial court had to do something, and the emperor should do something even more. Depose the emperor or expel him. Jing Jio pulled his black hair behind his back and tied it with a cloth ribbon, saying, "But don't try to kill me." The Grand Scholar wouldn't depose the emperor, even though he had realized that the emperor didn't want to be the emperor. If the throne was empty, those useless kings would step forward. It was unknown what Jing Silla would do in the distant Sangzhou. After some thought, the Grand Scholar said, "Your Majesty, please write an edict of self-reproach and then leave the cold palace." "Okay," said Jing Jio. The Grand Scholar sighed in his mind, got up, and walked toward the outside of the Grand Hall. The doorsill seemed to be ablaze in the twilight. As he stepped over the doorsill, the Grand Scholar suddenly thought of a possibility. He turned around and looked at Jing Jio, asking with beaming eyes, "Your Majesty, do you want to have a son?" Jing Jio's answer was simple and clear. "No, I don't." The twilight was getting darker, and the night had just arrived. The blood outside the Grand Hall had been washed away along with the snow water. No smell of blood could be detected, and the palace gate had even been repaired. The green bird flew over and landed on the window with a flutter of her wings, staring at Jing Jio. "Thank you very much," said Jing Jio. He seldom said thank you to anybody, because he seldom needed help from others. That day, when Duke Missouri stepped into the royal palace, the blue bird flew away from the chessboard and stood on a high eave, using the angle of view to choose the scene. The cultivation practitioners in the real world only knew that Duke Missouri was dead, but they didn't see him strike. And Tong Yin was sitting in a wheelchair with her back to the pavilion, so she couldn't see the specific scene either. There was no love or hate without a reason in the world. Any help needed to be repaid, but sometimes the recompense was a spiritual satisfaction. The blue bird didn't belong to this category. I hope you can help me figure out a problem, he said. Tell me, said Jingjio. The blue bird asked, why can Duke Missouri see the truth? At the time, Duke Missouri stood in the snow and took a look at the bird in the sky, and he saw the truth. As a result, the thunder struck down and the heavenly punishment occurred. The blue bird wasn't afraid of this. Otherwise, it wouldn't have left its paw prints on the snow to help Duke Missouri see the truth more clearly. Jingjio said, only the truth can be seen, and such things will happen more and more often in the illusionary realm. Why? Asked the blue bird. Jingjio stared at her eyes and said meaningfully, you have to ask yourself this question. The blue bird understood what Jingjio meant, remaining silent for a long time. If Duke Missouri woke up and became a real person, what kind of change would she, the spirit of the green sky mirror, experience? Or, in other words, she had undergone some changes that she wasn't aware of at some point in time, resulting in the occurrence of such things in the green sky mirror? When was that moment? The blue bird remembered that it should be when she lied to Bai Junren. Chapter 387. This was a difficult question to answer. Whether the answer was yes or no, it didn't sound good. As such, Jingjio didn't pay any attention to the blue bird. The blue bird rolled his eyeballs before asking, even if you drive that stupid child out of the illusionary realm, he can still tell someone else like Bai Junren. Jingjio said, as long as these participants in the Tao competition in the illusionary realm don't know my idea, it's fine. The blue bird said, but I can tell them your idea. You won't, said Jingjio. The blue bird felt frustrated, asking, how could you guess my choice? Jingjio said, it's because I know what you want. The blue bird fell silent for a long time before saying, I can't help you with that matter. When they played chess in the pavilion in the snow, she had said that she was the spirit of the green sky mirror, but not the rule. Jingjio understood what she meant, saying, I'll do it myself. The blue bird said, it's obviously impossible. Why do you look so confident? Jingjio said, maybe it's because I have more experience in this aspect. What should I do next? Asked the blue bird. Jingjio said, as I said, more and more people will know the secret of heaven. You should go and have a look at them. The snowy palace, the blood, and the corpses. Seeing the scene in the sky, the cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley were in an uproar, and then fell silent for a long time. Sensei and the young woman Shui Nunnery eyed each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes, but they didn't say anything. Tong Yin had died just like that. The Aoyama's sex attack was indeed swift and decisive. Yet, many people were puzzled. In their eyes, the Aoyama's sex attack didn't come at the right time and the result. Tong Yin is dead, but the Qin Kingdom's cavalry is still here. Jing of Silla will rebel. Bai Qianjuan's situation is suddenly very favorable. On the side of the Aoyama sect, the disciple of the No Mercy sect was killed, and Zhuoruzhui was severely wounded with a severed arm. Chu Kingdom would be greatly affected, losing the possibility of contending for hegemony with Qin State and Zhao State. Jingjio's action was extremely unwise. Why did he do it? In the deep part of the Huin Valley, the sunlight streamed down from the top of the cave, illuminating the slowly rotating green sky mirror. The puppets on the mirror were vivid and lifelike, as if they were coming to life, displaying scenes of joys and sorrows. Tong Yin sat on the cattail hassock and looked at the human world in silence. No one knew what she was thinking. The disciple of the No Mercy sect opened his eyes and woke up. Tong Yin looked over. The two of them separated again after exchanging glances. As the young girl Shui Nunnery had said to Sensei, the participants of the Tao competition couldn't bring the grudges in the illusionary realm back to the real world. As for what they would think in their minds, nobody knew. Tong Yin had already guessed the identity of this disciple of the No Mercy sect, but he was more alarmed than surprised. Even Lu Shisui had been released from the sword jail. It was evident that the Aoyama sect was well prepared for this Tao competition, and they were determined to win the fairy book of longevity. Thinking of the fairy book that could enchant all the cultivation practitioners and Jingjiu's methods, Tong Yin furrowed his eyebrows deeply, but his frown was still very faint, like a willow leaf blown by the wind. He placed his hands by his side and was about to push the wheelchair to leave. As soon as he touched the ground, he realized that he had returned to the real world, and this place was neither Tsangzhou nor the capital of Chu Kingdom. Many participants of the Dao competition by the Green Sky Mirror had woken up earlier. Seeing this scene, they couldn't help but let out a smile, thinking that Tong Yin, who had come to the center sect, had the same fate as them. Lu Shui had already remembered everything by now. Staring at the back of Tong Yin as he left, he thought that his young master must have concealed something significant, and that he should find a way to stall this person. Tong Yin returned to the small building along the passageway. He didn't go to the outside of the Huin Valley after coming out of the building. Instead, he employed the magic method and leapt up in the air. The escape method of heaven and earth was marvelous. In a few minutes, he had already broken through the clouds and arrived on the top of a very high peak on the Cloudtree Mountain. There was a wooden railing by the cliff's edge. The woman in white stood by the railing. Looking at the snowy mountain in the distance, she turned herself into a snowy mountain as well. Tong Yin landed on the peak top and said with a bow, "This disciple greets my master." Normally, as a swordsman in the Deshang state, she shouldn't care too much about the Dao competition, but it seemed that Bai Zhenren had been watching the competition for more than 20 days. "What does Jingjiu intend to do instead of being an emperor?" she asked. Tong Yin said, "He doesn't intend to participate in the competition for the hegemony of the world. He wants to kill all the participants of the Dao competition." "All by himself?" Bai Zhenren turned around. Her face seemed to be shrouded by a thin layer of fog, so her countenance couldn't be seen clearly, but a deep cold intent could be vaguely sensed. After some thought, Tong Yin was certain that her judgment was correct and said, "Yes." Bai Zhenren said, "An assassin like Zhou has no choice but to die. How can he be different?" The illusionary realm of the Green Sky Mirror had an upper limit. The cultivation practitioners could only reach the initial state of the Yuanying or the free travel. No matter how powerful they were, they couldn't resist the power of a state. After a moment of silence, Tong Yin said he should be preparing to break through the upper limit. The reason Jingjiu expelled him from the illusionary realm was because he didn't want him to tell Bai Qianjun and other participants of the Dao competition about this speculation. If other participants of the Dao competition learned of Jingjiu's idea and thought it was possible, they would launch an attack on the Chu kingdom in advance, hoping to kill him before he succeeded. "Where did this crazy idea come from?" asked Bai Zhenren. Tong Yin said, "Duke Missouri had the opportunity to break through the heavenly tribulation once. I think it was this event that inspired him. Is he going to ascend even in the illusionary realm?" Bai Zhenren let out a mocking smile. Tong Yin understood why her master disdained Jingjiu's idea. The Green Sky Mirror was a true heavenly treasure, and it was protected by the fairy energy. The spiritual souls of the participants in the Dao competition had no way to break through the forbidding formation. The same thing had happened to Duke Missouri in the past, but they were all killed by the will of the fairy masters. As such, Jingjiu had no choice but to face the same fate. Tong Yin didn't say anything more. Jingjiu's idea was indeed preposterous. Even if the other participants of the Dao competition knew his idea, they wouldn't believe it. But if it were merely a preposterous idea, why would Jingjiu do so many things and pay such a high price to expel her from the illusionary realm? Thinking of this, Tong Yin suddenly felt the wind on the peak top grew colder than before. For the people living in the royal palace, the cold palace was the coldest place. But Jingjiu didn't think so because he didn't feel anything. It was probably because he was still living in the Grand Hall. The rules were still the same, and the curtains were warm and bright. But the palace gate was sealed, and the eunuchs and servant girls weren't allowed to talk to him. One morning, the blue bird landed in front of the window and chirped twice. Jingjiu finished meditating and opened his eyes. The blue bird strolled to the front of Jingjiao from the bed and said while lifting his head to look at Jingjiao's face, "The decree of self-condemnation you have written is marvelous. I almost thought you were an idiotic and incapable emperor." "The Grand Scholar's writing is pretty good," said Jingjiao. By now, the blue bird realized that the decree of self-condemnation had been written by someone else. He spread his right wing to cover his head and said helplessly, "Can you be any lazier?" Jingjiao uttered, "Hmm." The blue bird thought it was the most boring thing in the world to chat with Jingjiao. "You won't be able to guess where I saw this decree of self-condemnation," he said with great effort. Jingjiao thought that it should be on the city walls of the capital and all the counties, but how would he know where he saw it? The blue bird said, "It was in the royal palace of Zhao Zhao." "What were you doing there?" asked Jingjiao. The blue bird said, "I went to look around as you said, but I didn't expect to actually see a person." Jingjiao looked at her in silence, saying nothing. Chapter 388. According to Jingjiao's suggestion, the blue bird wandered around this world in search of those who might be able to see through the secrets of heaven. In the end, she went to Zhao's imperial palace. She didn't like going to Zhao's imperial palace because it was filled with the smell of medicine and darkness, which was completely different from the image of Zhao in the mainland. Moreover, she disliked that eunuch very much. The blue bird landed on the corner of the eaves, looking like an animal on the eaves in the twilight. Dijon glanced at her imperceptibly and then withdrew his gaze, continuing to read the edict of self-condemnation of Emperor Chu in his hand. His eyebrows were very thin, and his face was a bit pale. The longer his gaze stayed on the edict, the higher his eyebrows were raised, and the more gloomy his expression became. Having stayed in the illusionary realm for too long, he had forgotten many things, and there were still many things that he couldn't forget, such as the pain in his childhood, the annoying blue bird that occasionally appeared, and the identities of some people. He knew that Emperor Chu was like him, and he was even more clear that Crown Prince Jing should be his friend. However, it was probably because of the word friend that he had never contacted Sangzhou directly. The death of Crown Prince Jing didn't make him feel sad. On the contrary, the edict of self-condemnation made him feel aggrieved and angry on behalf of Emperor Chu, and he felt that life was really boring. Living was really a dull and uninteresting thing. Dijon left the imperial study and came to the front of a palace, taking the medicine handed to him by a palace maid. This medicine was made by himself. The pharmacy was under the strictest supervision, and no one could poison it. Feeling the warmth from the bottom of the bowl, he nodded satisfactorily, pushed open the door, and walked in. He said to the young man in bright yellow behind the desk, "Your Majesty, it's time to take the medicine." Emperor Zhao looked at him and smiled. Then he started coughing painfully. His face was very pale. Standing next to Dijon, they looked like twin brothers. However, Dijon's paleness came from the rare sunlight, while the emperor's paleness came from his illness. Zhao Huang took the bowl of medicine and drank it in one gulp. He also took the wax gourd candy that Dijon took out from the box and put it in his mouth. His complexion and spirit were much better. Dijon advised, "There's no need to push yourself so hard. There's no harm in resting for a while." Zhao Huang walked to the wall and pulled the curtain aside. He pointed at the map of the continent and said, "There are still so many places waiting for us. How can we not be anxious?" His father was bound to become one of the most famous incompetent rulers in history, and in contrast, he was bound to become one of the most famous wise rulers in history. Under his rule, Zhao showed a flourishing attitude and gradually revealed its edge. All the dark side returned to Elder He, so his image was incomparably bright, and he won the hearts of the people. Dijon thought of the previous self-incriminating edict and said indifferently, "At least we don't have to worry about the Chu kingdom anymore." Zhao Huang said, "Jing of Silla doesn't have enough courage and is afraid of Mr. Xiaoyu's ability. He won't dare to rebel and will only take Sangzhou to another place." Dijon said, I haven't had much contact with Sangzhou in recent years, so it's hard to win it over. But even if he wants to go to Xianying, I'll find a way to cut more of his flesh. That's the general plan. You and the military can decide how to carry it out. But Zhao Huang glanced at him and said, "You don't have to be as ruthless as you were in the past and ruin your reputation. It won't do you any good." He said calmly, "I like to make people afraid. It's convenient to get things done this way." Zhao Huang shook his head and pointed at another place on the map, saying, "The canal in Ji County is almost ready. You can leave the task of building the high dam to someone else." Looking at that place, He thought back to many years ago. At that time, he was still a little eunuch in concubine Ping's palace, and His Majesty was still the crown prince who could be sentenced to death at any time. They talked about many things by the lake in the Imperial Garden, such as how to get out of the current situation and what they would do if they succeeded. The canal in Ji County was one of their topics. This canal was very important to Zhao. Once it was repaired, it could irrigate thousands of acres of fertile land. At the same time, it would become a sharp sword hanging over the head of the Qi kingdom. In order to repair this canal, Zhao spent a great deal of resources and energy. He was even forced to slow down the process of digesting Luo. Now it seemed that it was all worth it. If the high dam were to be used in the future, it would be harmful to the harmony of the world. The person in charge of it would definitely be infamous. Therefore, Zhao Huang didn't want He to take over personally. He didn't refuse His Majesty's kindness this time. He said, "I'll choose a suitable person. The people of Qi will definitely find a way to make trouble, and then I'll kill another group." The emperor smiled helplessly and said, "Can you stop thinking about killing people all day long?" As the dusk deepened, the shadows from the windows faded, and the light in the hall became red and warm. The emperor and He's voices became softer and softer. The eunuchs and palace maids watched this scene from outside the hall with smiles on their faces. The people in the palace were already used to seeing such a scene of the emperor and his official discussing the state affairs together. It was a pity that he was a eunuch with a terrible reputation. Otherwise, he would have become a legend in history. As night fell, lights were lit in the palace. The emperor was a little tired. He coughed a few times and sat down on the bed with He's help. He said again, "Take care of yourself." The emperor placed his left hand on his knee and waved his right hand. "You know that I don't have many years to live. How can I not be anxious?" If it were any other official, he would have burst into tears and said that His Majesty was in the prime of his life. He didn't do that. He only looked at the emperor in silence. The emperor lowered his head, looking a little tired. He looked at the top of the emperor's head. The three swirls clearly represented intelligence. The emperor had always been a very intelligent person. "I want to do something for the people of Zhao State and for the people of the world. If I can't do it in time," the emperor still lowered his head and said, "Help me finish these things." Even if the emperor didn't ask him to do so, He would do it anyway because it was what he wanted to do. He endured the humiliation and pain and walked in the darkness without seeing the sun just to conquer all the countries, become the ruler of the world, and finally win the throne. He was silent for a long time and suddenly asked, "Are these last words or entrusting an orphan?" The difference between last words and entrusting an orphan was the word orphan. It became very quiet in the hall. The eunuchs and palace maids had already left. The emperor slowly raised his head and looked at him. "You still don't support my decision? Just a few days ago, something big happened in Zhao State. The emperor was weak and had no children, so he decided to choose a nephew from the royal family to be his adopted son. Finally, after several selections, the emperor chose the clever and honest boy from the prince of Hejin County. I have always opposed this decision," He calmly said. "He is a wolf cub who can't be raised well." It was related to the succession of the throne, so a eunuch had no right to comment, let alone speak so rudely and impudently. The emperor didn't get angry. After a moment of silence, he said, "This is the only way. Help me keep an eye on him." He said, "Okay." Yet, the emperor grew angry because he knew He was lying. He had made his attitude very clear when he asked if these were last words or entrusting an orphan. I know that you won't treat that child like you treat me after I die. The emperor stared into Hejan's eyes and said, because you have always wanted to be a real emperor. Hejan was silent for a while and said, it's actually not wrong to say so. There were many rumors about this matter in the court and even in foreign countries. The emperor didn't ask about it, and Hejan didn't say anything until tonight. The emperor's face grew even paler, and flames of anger danced in his eyes as if he were looking at a traitorous villain. Hejan was infuriated by the look in his eyes and said, without me, could you become emperor? Without me, you would have died countless times. The emperor said in a low voice, but this is what you should do. Hejan said with slight mockery, why? Because you're the emperor, and I am a subject? The emperor was silent for a while and said, no, because we are friends. Hejan said, I have forgotten many things, but I always remember that the word friend is not to be trusted. Hearing it makes me feel disgusted. The emperor was silent for a long time and suddenly said, did you do something to the chestnut tree on the slope in the imperial garden? Hejan frowned slightly and said, how did you know? The emperor said, you had not completed your martial arts at the time, so it was inevitable that some traces would be left. Hejan said, back then, you also investigated me and knew that I had a relationship with the old eunuch Hong, so you became acquainted with me. To put it bluntly, you were also using me. The emperor said with some disappointment, yes, from the very beginning, we were using each other. Hejan said nothing. The emperor suddenly coughed, appearing to be in great pain. Hejan frowned slightly and took out a medicinal pill. After thinking for a long time, he cut off a quarter of it and fed it to the emperor, then helped him lie down. The emperor's coughing gradually stopped, and he calmed down, closing his eyes to rest. Hejan took his leave and prepared to leave. The emperor suddenly called out to him and looked at his back, asking, are not a person of this world? Hejan's body was somewhat stiff as he said, what nonsense are you talking about? The emperor withdrew his gaze and looked at the starry sky outside the window. In the past, I did not think that this world was fake. It was not until I discovered that you had no feelings for this world that I began to think about this problem. Hejan said, I don't understand what you mean. The emperor said, to this world, you are like an eternal guest. To you, I seem to be an eternal stranger. This is what I mean. Hejan lowered his head and thought for a while, then said, I will serve you to the end. I won't do anything, and I will also ensure the empress's good fortune for the rest of her life. Having said this, he walked out of the palace hall. From beginning to end, he did not turn around or look back. If you were not a eunuch, what would it matter if I gave the throne to you? The emperor's voice came from behind him. Walking out of the palace hall, a eunuch helped him put on a large cloak. It was unavoidably cold in the depths of the night. Dozens of eunuchs clustered around him as he walked out of the royal palace. These eunuchs were all Hejan's subordinates and possessed terrifying battle prowess. Under these circumstances, it would be very difficult to kill Hejan. Seeing that the palace gate was right in front of him, Hejan suddenly stopped and said, I'm going to take a look somewhere. Wait for me here. Hearing this, the eunuchs were alarmed. They thought that there were countless heroes and warriors in the world who wanted to kill Elder He. Even the royal palace was not safe. What was the eunuch planning to do? Hejan came to the imperial garden. He stood under the chestnut tree, silently gazing into the distance. The starlight shone on his black cloak. He looked at it like a demon of nostalgia. Chapter 389. Yesterday, I wrote, "een is woo." What does that mean? It means that I used 5 strokes instead of pinyin. I rarely make such a low-level mistake now. Does it mean that I'm more cultured? No, it just means that I use fewer and fewer complicated words in my books. Is this laziness? Of course not. It means that I've become more self-aware and my taste has improved. Today is the first anniversary of the opening of Didao. To summarize, I'm very satisfied. Thank you. Hejan walked out of the imperial palace and walked on the street with the eunuchs. Pedestrians gave way to him. There were fewer and fewer people on the street, because there was a gloomy yamen at the end of the long street. This was the intelligence bureau founded by Hejan. It was under the direct control of His Majesty. In most cases, this was his yamen. There were thousands of spies in the intelligence bureau and even more red-armored cavalrymen. Most of the high-level officials were eunuchs promoted by Hejan. They could directly supervise and arrest ministers and even nobles without the approval of the Ministry of Justice. They had great power. The eunuchs and officials were dressed in low-key black clothes. The powerful red-armored cavalrymen were dressed in embroidered clothes. They were dazzling even in the dark night. As Hejan walked into the yamen, the eunuchs and red-armored cavalrymen bowed to him. He walked to the highest place expressionlessly, took off his big robe, and threw it to his subordinates. Then he sat down in a chair. All of them knelt down and said in unison, "Greetings, Your Excellency." Hejan was still expressionless. He raised his finger slightly and signaled them to stand up. Then he supported his chin with his right hand and closed his eyes to rest. The subordinates knew Their Excellency's habit. They stepped forward to report the recent situation as usual. The students of the Wansong Academy complained a lot. They even secretly contacted the Confucian scholars of the Qi Kingdom. They wanted to do something disgraceful. 13 of the leaders have been imprisoned. The official paused and continued, but the news leaked too fast. The students of the academy have gathered. If we suppress it by force, I'm afraid it will cause. Hejan closed his eyes and said, "You can't kill the scholar. Killing him would be what they want. As for how to deal with him, do you want me to teach you?" His tone was very calm, but the official was instantly drenched in cold sweat. In a trembling voice, he said, "The factory is making preparations, but it will take some time to prepare those letters. We will accuse the leaders of colluding with Qin, and then some righteous people will break into their homes, or set them on fire, or kill them." Hejan was somewhat dissatisfied and said, "It's still too rough. Be more meticulous." The official wiped the sweat off his brow and retreated. Another official stepped forward to report. The Qi merchants have been slow to react to the Tao Mountain Canal incident, but the He and Xiao families are obviously on high alert. They are sending large amounts of money into the capital in an attempt to bribe the high-ranking officials of the court. Hejan opened his eyes and slowly scanned the faces of his subordinates. If Qi Shang wanted to bribe the courtiers, these eunuchs from the intelligence bureau would be the main targets. They would have been fattened by now. No one dared to raise their heads and look Hejan in the eyes. The official who reported suppressed the fear in his heart and said with a pale face, "Your Excellency, please give us your orders. We won't touch the Tao Mountain Canal, so you could take as much money as you want from the Qi merchants." Hejan said expressionlessly, "But they have to send me what I want as soon as possible. I'll give them as much money as they want. But if they still refuse to send me the information about the treasure ship, then release the news that the sea merchants of the Qi Kingdom humiliated our ambassador, and then let Orchid Island go ashore." The officials of the Intelligence Bureau felt the air in the yamen became colder. The merchants of the Qi Kingdom could be bribed, and they could also be deterred by killing. Everyone knew that the little elder, he was not a patient person. If he failed to bribe them once, he would kill them. But today it was obvious that his killing intent was especially strong. The sea merchants of the Qi Kingdom humiliated the ambassador of Zhao State's ambassador, but Orchid Island was a real killer. Both the Qi Kingdom and Zhao State, and even the officials of the Intelligence Bureau were guessing that this famous pirate was a fierce dog raised by the little elder He. As for why the eunuch was so concerned about the information about the treasure ship, no one could figure it out. The third official began his report. Censor Chen still refuses to admit it. Then continue the interrogation. Interrogate him carefully and carefully. Don't let him die, and don't let him live too comfortably. Hejan thought of the stubborn censor, and a mocking smile appeared on his face, but no one knew who it was meant for. Speaking of which, if the imperial court is full of these fatherless, widowed officials, how can we work for His Majesty? The official plucked up his courage and asked, "If he confesses about the West Hui, how should we interrogate him next?" The West Hui was a scenic spot in the Hejin prefecture. Hejan lifted his eyelids and glanced at the official, asking, "What benefits did Hajin send you?" The official said with a bitter smile, "If I had received benefits, I wouldn't have dared to ask this question. But it's a prince's mansion after all." Hearing this, the officials in the Intelligence Bureau changed their expressions slightly, feeling that this was a bit difficult. If it were an ordinary prince's mansion, the Intelligence Bureau could easily investigate it. Currently, there were 2 commandery princes and 3 imperial uncles in the imperial prison. Who would be afraid of them? But the one in the prince's mansion of Hajin was the future emperor. Hijan looked at his subordinates in silence, saying, "I only have eyes for His Majesty and no one else. Do you understand?" Hearing this, the officials all knelt on the ground, not daring to say a word. In the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom, in the coldest palace hall, the starlight became even colder. The blue bird strolled to the front of Jingjiao. Thinking of the scenes he had seen in the capital of the state of Zhao, he said fearfully, "That eunuch is truly abnormal and dreadful." "Tell me about Zhao Huang," said Jingjiao. The blue bird came back to his senses and said, "The relationship between Yijan and Zhao Huang is indeed complicated and subtle. But how can Zhao Huang see through the reality of the world? I can't understand it." In the green sky mirror, some people had reached a very high cultivation state, but they were eventually wiped out by the heavenly punishment. But the situation for Duke Missouri and Zhao Huang was different. The 2 of them had realized clearly, or, in other words, they had sensed that the world they were in was not real. The illusionary realm was not the real world, and the world they sought was not the real world. So the people in the world were not the real beings. However, if someone realized the unreality of the world, it meant that they had seen the reality and become the reality. She had lived in the green sky mirror for tens of thousands of years, but she had never seen anything like this. Like I said, you have to start with yourself. Jingjiao continued while looking at the bluebird. You have to know who you are first. The blue bird walked to the edge of the teacup and looked at the surface of the water, where she saw the reflection of a bird. A gust of wind rose, creating ripples on the surface of the teacup, blurring the reflection of the bird. She had turned into an icy little girl, her transparent wings flapping slightly, bringing up a fresh and clean wind, exuding a faint fairy intent in all directions. Though the people in the imperial palace couldn't sense it, the trees outside the window and the birds in their nests could sense it. Qing'e looked at the teacup again, and then lifted her head to look at Jingjiao, saying confusedly, "I am me." Jingjiao said, "When I saw you in the small building for the first time, I was certain that you were the true spirit of the heavenly state, but I was still a bit lacking." Feeling baffled, Qing'e asked, "What's the difference?" Jingjiao dipped his finger in the teacup and smeared it between her eyebrows, saying, "Though you don't know it yourself, it's not a bit lacking now." Qing'e felt a cool sensation between her eyebrows as she recalled that scene again. It was the same peak top and the snowy mountains outside and inside the railing. She had lied to Bai Junren. It was not a big lie. It was merely a harmless lie. Yet, it was the first time she had lied. Yes, from that moment on, I had become a complete true spirit of the heavenly state. Looking at Jingjiao, Qing'e asked inquisitively, "But what does it have to do with what has happened in the green sky mirror?" Jingjiao said, "The true spirit of the heavenly state has its own cultivation state. It is born with the world in it." Qing'e was startled. "Is it true?" she asked while covering her mouth with her small hand. "How did you know?" Those true spirits of the heavenly state in the ancient times had ascended with the immortals in the ancient times, or they had perished over time. It had been many years since the true spirit of the heavenly state had appeared. Nobody knew what the true spirit of the heavenly state meant. The sect master of the Zhongzhou school didn't know, neither did Bai Junren, and even Qing'e herself, but Jingjiao knew it. "I've seen a true spirit of the heavenly state before. You are the second one." Jingjiao continued, "Once you become a true spirit of the heavenly state, you will enter the hidden world state." Qing'e exclaimed incredulously, "As I remember, your hidden world state is above the Mahayana state." Does it mean that I'm a fairy lady now? You can think of it that way, said Jingjiu. Qing exclaimed with widened eyes. It's because I've become a fairy lady that the people in the green sky mirror have woken up? Jingjiu said, the hidden world is the real world, not the illusionary realm. As such, the people in the green sky mirror will become real people. It took Qing a long time to understand what Jingjiu meant. So, I'm a master of this world? She asked uncertainly. Jingjiu said, you can understand it that way. But your situation is quite different from the hidden world I've seen. Our world is a patch of empty space, but your world is a world that has existed for tens of thousands of years. According to my calculation, when the world in the green sky mirror is destroyed, you will disappear along with it. So, it's more like a symbiotic relationship. Qing said with an intoxicated expression while holding her small fists, I suddenly feel that I'm a great person, no, a grand person. You've thought too much, said Jingjiu. Qing didn't want to pay attention to him. What should I do next? She asked. Wait, Jingjiu said. We can't let anybody else know about it. There hasn't been a fairy lady like me in Chaotian for many years, Qing said proudly. What should I be afraid of except that monster in the north? Jingjiu said. The cultivation state doesn't represent the fighting prowess. You said it yourself that you're merely the mirror spirit, not the ruler. Moreover, the fairy book is here. Qing understood what Jingjiu meant, feeling a bit frustrated. She suddenly thought of something and asked, what is the true spirit of the heavenly state that you've seen before? It's a mushroom, replied Jingjiu. What? Exclaimed Qing with widened eyes. Sometimes it's a blade of grass, sometimes it's a rock, and sometimes it's even a monkey. Chapter 390. Qing didn't understand what Jingjiu meant. She thought about it carefully, but still couldn't figure out. As such, she gave up and asked, aren't you worried about the Qin kingdom in Zhao? By Qianjun and that damned eunuch are truly formidable, not to mention that little Zhao is still in the illusionary realm. The affairs of others have nothing to do with me, said Jingjiu. Qing recalled the scene on this bed more than 10 years ago. She really likes you, she said with a sigh. I thought there would be many stories between the two of you, but I didn't expect you to be so heartless, she sighed. It's all fake, said Jingjiu. Qing said with widened eyes, but you said that this world is becoming real. Jingjiu said, for any world, those who are destined to leave this world are all fake. This statement had a deeper meaning. It was evident that it referred not only to the world in the green sky mirror, but also to the real world outside. Qing stared at him for a long time and suddenly asked, what are you doing in this world then? I want the fairy book, said Jingjiu. Every participant in the Dao competition who entered the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror aimed at the fairy book of longevity. This was a crude answer, but it could also be said to be simple and straightforward. Qing asked him earnestly, are you sure you can succeed? I can't help you under the circumstances. Jingjiu said, I've chosen a different method and a different path. We'll know who is right in the end. When people recalled the past events and tried to sort out their memories, they would often choose some important events as the time points. The sad thing was that those important events were usually not happy events, but funerals. For instance, a senior member of the family closed his eyes while sitting on the bamboo chair, or many white banners were blown down by the wind at the funeral of a relative. As far as the populace was concerned, the funerals were of a higher standard, and the dead had to be heavy enough to leave a deep impression on their collective memory, which would become a spiritual record for them. For instance, the death of an emperor. As far as this event was concerned, it was hard to distinguish between a funeral and a happy event, because the death of the old emperor meant the ascension of a new emperor. In the palace of the Qin kingdom, the old man on the sickbed had a face full of wrinkles. His white hair was as dry as the frost grass in late autumn. His eyes were sunken and his breathing was weak. It seemed that he was going to die soon. Crown Prince Baizhou, who was also known as Bai Qianjun, did not show any signs of sorrow. because he would be the new king of the Qin kingdom, and also because he didn't have much affection for this old man. Even if more than 20 years had worn away a lot of memories, at least he remembered clearly that this old man was not his real biological father. The dying emperor was originally just a member of a remote royal family. Relying on his innate ability to deal with people and an occasional burst of passion, he went to Beihai County to attack the commandery prince and even got the real position of the governor. During the confrontation with the northern barbarians for decades, he concealed his cowardice better and better. He also accumulated a profound strength and finally became the new emperor of the Qin kingdom by the trend of the world. This period of history could be called a resurgence, or even the founding of the country. The old emperor should have been written more vividly in the history books, but unfortunately, he gave birth to an even more brilliant son. The young martial god of the past had now become the god of massacre of the northern kingdom, who could stop children from crying at night. Even in the palace of the Qin kingdom, no one dared to look him in the eyes. I don't like being called a god, because I know I'm not one. I also don't like being called Taizong or Taizong, because I think that neither you nor the previous emperors are qualified to be ranked before me. So, I've decided to call myself White Emperor after my ascension. What do you think of the name White Emperor? Bai Qianjun said, "The coronation ceremony is ready, so you should die tonight. Don't waste my time." After saying this, he walked out of the hall. The old emperor stared at his back, his eyes full of resentment and regret. There were countless palaces in the palace of Xianying. In terms of quantity, only the education palace of the Qi kingdom could be mentioned in the same breath. In the darkness of the night, those palaces looked like countless ferocious beasts crouching, ready to pounce and tear their prey apart. Under the starlight, they looked even more ferocious. Bai Qianjun walked to the deepest palace, waved his hand, and chased everyone away. He followed the sound of the zither and found that person. A pond under the porch reflected the lights of the lanterns. There a young girl played the zither lightly. Her white dress fluttered in the darkness, like a lotus in the pond. The whole scene gave off a lonely and pitiful feeling, very much in line with the image of a fallen princess being imprisoned in the cold palace. But in fact, her eyes were calm, and there were no unnecessary emotions. "I'm going to be enthroned tomorrow." Bai Qianjun walked up to her and looked down at her, his eyes full of affection and love. "Congratulations, senior brother," Bai Zhao said with a smile, lifting his head. The emotions in Bai Qianjun's eyes had disappeared a long time ago, as he said, "I have received the news from the Qi kingdom." Upon hearing this, the expression on Bai Zhao's face changed a bit. It was evident that she was more concerned about the incident in the Qi kingdom than the death of the Qin emperor and the change of the dynasty. Many of the 20-odd participants who had entered the illusionary realm had died. Those who were still alive had basically been identified. Only the disciple of Yamatai hadn't shown up yet. The scholar named Shi Yun hadn't been discovered since the beginning. He didn't leave any trace in the illusionary realm, as if he had never been there. This was what Tong Yin wanted to know the most. But he didn't know how Shi Yun had done it, not until he was killed by Jing Jiao and driven out of the illusionary realm. Bai Zhao was also concerned about this matter. He had asked the spy organization of the Qin kingdom to investigate this matter for many years, and they had finally found some clues in the early spring. His name is Yunqi here. He used to study under Duke Missouri, and later went to the Academy of Qi Kingdom to take care of the books. He started to give lectures 2 years ago. Bai Qianjun continued. He hasn't had any contact with the outside world over the last few years. But a disciple he took some time ago had some contact with a scholar from the Wansong Institute of Zhao. Hearing the word give lectures, Bai Zhao had roughly understood what this disciple of Yamatai intended to do, but he was still puzzled. How did he manage to hide his identity so well? The expression on Bai Qianjun's face grew complicated as he said, "It's because he doesn't even know who he is." Bai Zhao was taken aback a bit as he asked, "Do you mean that he has completely forgotten his identity?" Bai Qianjun nodded. Feeling startled, Bai Zhao asked, "Are you sure?" Bai Qianjun said, I've sent 7 groups of people to give it a try. I'm sure that he has indeed forgotten his identity as a participant of the Tao competition, and that all he wants to do is to save the people and achieve the Tao. Looking at the strings on the zither, Bai Zhao remained silent. The participants of the Tao competition might actually forget their past events after living in the illusionary realm for too long and being confused by the mortal world, but it was evident that Shi Yun didn't do that. It was more like he had intentionally forgotten his past events. Why'd he do that? After a long while, she remarked sentimentally, It's truly marvelous. Bai Qianjun had the same opinion, asking, How should we deal with it? The masters of Yamatai don't cultivate, but their Tao hearts are as firm as a rock and can't be shaken. Bai Zhao said, We have to find a way to kill him right now. Otherwise, he will be a big trouble in the future. Bai Qianjun suddenly said, I've also forgotten something. As long as I don't think about it, I will naturally forget it. But there are some things that I can't forget even if I don't want to. Even the most tranquil gaze could be sensed, not to mention the heat hidden behind the tranquility. Bai Zhao didn't raise his head as he asked, Big Brother Tong, Yin has gone out. What do you think? Bai Qianjun pulled back his gaze slowly and looked at the unreal reflections of the lanterns on the pond, his voice a bit cold. I opposed him going to the capital of the Chu kingdom in the first place. Young sister, you and he both attach too much importance to Jingjiao. Bai Zhao said lightly, Big Brother is dead, which proves that Jingjiao is worthy of our attention, as I said. After a moment of silence, Bai Qianjun said, Young sister, you are always right. Looking at his profile in silence, Bai Zhao said, Yes. Is there anything wrong? There is nothing wrong. Everything is going according to your and Tong Yan's plan, and the fairy book will fall into our hands in the end. A gust of night wind passed through the palace, shattering the reflections of the lanterns as far as the eye could see. Looking in that direction in silence, Bai Qianjun said, I just want to forget some more things all of a sudden. Having said this, he turned around and walked out of the hall to prepare for the coronation ceremony the next day. Looking at the surface of the water, Bai Zhao said nothing. She understood what he meant, but she found it boring. The broken reflections of the lanterns on the surface of the pond slowly gathered together. She thought of the news from the Chu kingdom. After issuing the Edict of Self-Condemnation, Jingjiao was put under house arrest by that grand scholar in the Cold Palace. The Edict of Self-Condemnation was certainly not written by him, and it was of his own accord that he was put under house arrest in the Cold Palace, just like Zhao Lei. Thinking of these coincidences, Bai Zhao smiled, feeling it was quite interesting. Another 5 years passed. The White Emperor of the Qin Kingdom was tyrannical, imposing taxes and imposing exorbitant taxes. He forced 3,000 wealthy families in Luoxi to move to Xianyang. Complaints were heard everywhere, but they were immediately suppressed. Under his personal command, 30,000 cavalrymen swept across the north of the continent like the sharpest sword. They were invincible, and even the barbaric tribes retreated in fear. The only country that could compete with the Qin Kingdom, Zhao encountered a major event at this time. Their emperor was about to die. This emperor was extremely wise, and he was a master of both leniency and severity. Unfortunately, he was born with a weak body and had no children. In the past 5 years, probably because of these problems, the court and the people of Zhao had been permeated with a strange atmosphere. The emperor issued a series of edicts, appointing and dismissing people, restricting the power of the intelligence bureau, and supporting his supporters. It was obvious that he was going to take action against Elder He. However, no matter how much the officials and people of Zhao State and even the merchants of Qi State waited, the emperor didn't do anything to Master Eunuchy in the end. He even trusted Master Eunuchy and only drank the medicine brewed by Master Eunuchy. The smell of medicine in the hall was much lighter than in previous years, probably because the windows were open and ventilation was good. Grand Secretary Zhang is 50 years older than us. No matter how hard he tries, he won't be able to last until 20 years later. The emperor's pale face did not improve after drinking the medicine. He leaned on the bed and panted. From now on, you're the only one who can deal with the White Emperor. He did not say anything, nor did he advise the emperor to take a good rest. Everyone knew that the emperor could not hold on for more than a few days. Facing the emperor's expectant and pleading eyes, He remained silent for a while. He patted the back of the emperor's hand and still did not say anything. A wind came in from outside the palace, followed by the empress. She walked to the bed with tears on her face and pushed He away roughly. She sat beside the emperor and held his hand. He walked out of the hall and faintly heard a faint sigh behind him. That very night, the emperor of Zhao died. He watched him die with his own eyes. Then he calmly began to arrange all kinds of affairs. When he was almost done, he went back to his room to sleep for an hour. During the whole process, he did not do anything out of line or disrespectful. The empress asked someone to ask him. After knowing that he did not go to the imperial garden, she remained silent for a long time. She did not know whether she should be happy or disappointed. Before dawn, the imperial palace was filled with officials in plain clothes. Many of them went out of the city to welcome the emperor according to the rules. The crown prince of King Hejian was going to the capital to inherit the throne. Normally, it had been decided 5 years ago. The crown prince should have been raised in the imperial palace as a crown prince and directly inherited the throne today. But for some reason, the proposal was not approved. It was said that Elder he did not like the crown prince and secretly did something. Time passed slowly. The morning light gradually illuminated the eaves of the palace. However, the officials who went out of the city to welcome the emperor had not returned yet. The atmosphere inside and outside the imperial palace was a bit tense. What on earth happened? The sound of hooves came from the long street. Horses reported quickly. Then it was reported. The officials and nobles on both sides of the jade stairs in front of the hall stared at the official of the Ministry of Rights as if they wanted to eat him alive. The official of the Ministry of Rights said nervously with a pale face, "The Crown Prince. The Crown Prince." No, he refused to go through the Zhongming Gate. He wanted to go through the Xihua Gate. Hearing this, the front of the hall suddenly became silent. The officials looked at each other and did not know what to do. The crown prince ascended the throne through the Zhongming Gate. The emperor returned to the palace through the Xihua Gate. It was simple but very important. At every important historical moment, there was always a shortage of officials in the imperial court who were brave enough to take charge. Soon, the silence in front of the hall was broken. A Hamlin Academy official stood out and began to quote the classics to prove the correctness of the emperor's decision to go through the Xihua Gate. Then, several other officials agreed. Great achievements naturally came with great risks. But the real bigwigs on the scene remained silent. The voices of the officials in the debate gradually lowered. All eyes were fixed on one place. It was not the highest place, and it was even a little far from the jade stairs. It was the shadow of a corner of the hall. A man was standing in the shadow. If you don't want to go through the Jingming Gate, then please go back. During the whole process of the new emperor's enthronement, Hejian only said this one sentence. It was recorded in the history books. Chapter 391. Zhongming Gate was a side gate of the royal palace. Unlike its name, it was not very bright. It was dark, quiet, and somewhat frightening. The young emperor looked at the dark and long passageway in front of him and thought of the words the palace servant had passed on earlier. His face paled slightly. Given his temperament, he wanted nothing more than to turn and leave at this moment and return to Hejin Manor to be his own heir. But 5 years ago, his mother had told him that if he went to Jingdo, nothing else mattered except for two things: to be filial to the empress and not to offend Elder He. He didn't understand what was so frightening about that eunuch and why the entire state of Zhao was as silent as a cicada in front of him. He also didn't understand why he had to be subservient to a eunuch if he became emperor. It didn't matter if he didn't understand. His mother used an extreme method to make him remember this matter and never forget it. Not long after she said those words 5 years ago, his mother died of illness. Everyone knew that it was because she had to die. A country could not have two masters, and an emperor could not have two mothers. Thinking of these things, the youth's face paled even more. He took a deep breath and walked through the palace gate. Seeing this scene, the officials finally relaxed. The history books recorded that during the process of the new emperor's ascension, eunuch Hejan only said one thing. Of course, this was not true, but no one else could hear what he said other than the young emperor. The light in the side hall of the Wenhua palace was dim. Hejan's face was hidden in the shadows. The young emperor became even more nervous and unconsciously looked outside the hall. The old people from Hajin Manor who had followed him into the palace were waiting outside. They had not been driven away or replaced. This fact did not comfort him at all. It only showed that the people in the palace had absolute confidence in controlling him. Hejan said, "Back then, Your Majesty should have entered the palace as the crown prince to learn government affairs, but you were stopped. The rumors said it was me, but it was not me." Hearing these words, the little emperor had the misconception that eunuch He was afraid and wanted to express his loyalty to him. His expression became a bit strange. Fortunately, Elder He's next words came very quickly, avoiding a misunderstanding. The new emperor only treated it as a one-day farce. "I'm not afraid, nor am I trying to explain. I just want to tell Your Majesty that I know you were the one who didn't want to enter the palace 5 years ago." Hejan said, "But in the end, it has come to this. I cannot think about it, so I'll just live in the palace." His tone was very calm and unhurried, but the words and attitude in his words made the little emperor feel extreme anger and then extreme fear. Anger stemmed from helplessness. Naturally, fear grew in one's heart. The little emperor's lips trembled. He wanted to say a few words, but in the end, nothing came out. The people who were secretly sent to the capital by Hajin Prefecture in the past 5 years have been caught in the early hours of this morning. I believe they're all dead by now. Hejan's tone was still very calm as he said, "Your Majesty will not be harassed by those ill-intentioned rebels in the future." The little emperor's face became abnormally pale. The Hajin Prefecture had made a lot of preparations. In the past 5 years, no one knew how much gold and silver, as well as men of sacrifice and counselors, had been sent to the capital, just to ensure that he could sit firmly on the throne. Who would have thought that all these things had been under the control of the Intelligence Bureau the whole time? It only took one night to wipe them all out. These people I brought into the palace, are they all going to be killed? The little emperor could no longer control his emotions. He stared into Hejan's eyes and said angrily, "Eunuch, don't you want to save some face for the royal family?" Hejan said, "Of course not. You should know that from now on, you are the son of the late emperor and the ruler of Zhao State. I will give you full respect." The order of a narration was very important. You have to remember that you are the son of a late emperor and have nothing to do with Hajin Prefecture anymore. If you can't remember this, many more people will die, and you might not even be the new emperor of Zhao State. The little emperor was silent for a long time. Then he asked with frustration and mockery, "How should I address you from now on, eunuch?" Hejan said, "In private, I allow you to call me uncle." Having said that, he walked toward the outside of the hall of Wenhua. Looking at the back of the dark figure, the little emperor's face was full of shock and absurdity. Eventually, it turned into fear. The Yuan Palace was the bedroom of the Empress. Today, the Empress had become the Empress Dowager, but she still lived here. The Empress Dowager and the late Emperor had a good relationship. Since the Empress Dowager had been supporting the Empress Dowager for 5 years, her relationship with Elder He was naturally not good. Hejan walked into the hall. He looked a bit tired. Seeing him like this, the Empress Dowager felt less sorrow and sneered silently. "I have finished talking with His Majesty. It went well." Hejan said, "As we have discussed before, Your Majesty, you will stay behind the curtain, and I won't show up. You know very well whether it is inconvenient to show up or not." The Empress Dowager said, "A eunuch can't show up in the open after all. I don't understand why you are still holding on. I can kill you with a decree. Your Majesty, you should call yourself Ijia." Hejan's expression didn't change. There's no longer a person like Duke Missouri in the world. The imperial court is in my hands. No one in the world can kill me. Even if they can, Your Majesty, you shouldn't do it." The Empress Dowager slightly raised her chin and proudly said, "Without Ijia, you can't do anything." Hijan said, "Likewise, relying on those idiotic imperial uncles of Your Majesty's, the court will change hands in less than 10 years. Your Majesty, you will be invited to the cold palace, and your family will be slaughtered." The chestnut tree was still in the imperial palace. They were still using each other. The Empress Dowager was silent for a while. The matter this time will not be settled so easily. Everyone knew the difference between the Zhengming school and the Xihua school, and the relationship between the young emperor and elder He. How could those courageous officials in the court who were good at opportunism miss this opportunity? Led by the censorate, the imperial censorate began to launch a tentative attack. The students of the Imperial College and the scholars of the Wansong Academy reacted even more violently. According to the investigation of the Intelligence Bureau, the shadow of the Qi Kingdom's Academy was vaguely behind all these incidents. All the clues pointed to the scholar named Yun Qi. Dozens of days later, the attacks on Hijan entered a new stage. Neither the chancellors in the court nor the Empress Dowager in the imperial palace showed any reaction, even though they were also the ones being attacked by the scholars. As long as Hijan personally suppressed the matter, his reputation would become worse and more loopholes would be exposed no matter what the final result was. Hijan didn't pay attention to this matter, nor did he show up. He waited until the Intelligence Bureau got those things and then entered the imperial palace late at night to seek an audience with the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager wanted to stall for time by saying that she didn't want to see Elder He since it was late, but how could the palace guard stop him? Looking at Hijan, who still appeared in front of her, the Empress Dowager tightened her clothes. She was extremely furious and shouted, "What on earth do you want to do?" Hijan didn't say anything. He placed the files in front of her. The Empress Dowager glanced at them and became even more furious. "Are you trying to frame me?" she demanded. "This is the matter of Your Majesty's family. Your Majesty doesn't know anything about it, and it's not a plot," Hijan said, seizing the fertile land by force, forcing the magistrate to commit suicide, and oppressing men and women are all trivial matters, but it's a big deal to unite Qi. If the people knew that Your Majesty's family has been supported by the merchants of the Qi Kingdom all these years, how would they react? Having said that, he left the royal palace, not even taking the files with him. The Empress Dowager looked at the files in silence for the whole night. She finally made a decision the next morning. She summoned several ministers to the royal palace and issued several edicts. The ministers accepted the edicts. The censorate was purged. Those who should be in prison were imprisoned, and those who should be exiled were exiled. The Wansong Academy was sealed. The classes of the Imperial College were temporarily suspended because of the reconstruction of the Ming Hall. All these things were thrilling. The most thrilling was, of course, the sound of caning outside the royal palace. Some officials shouldered the burden of Taoist heart, and some were unyielding, but their butts were soft. How could their official robes not be stained red after being caned more than 10 times? The situation gradually calmed down. Though the secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau and the officials in Elder He's faction didn't do anything during the whole process, it still couldn't stop the people from blaming him for the crimes, just like they had done in the past years. Elder He's reputation was even worse. He seemed to have become a real devil. For the naughty children who cried at night, his deterrence was even greater than that of the terrible White Emperor of the Qin Kingdom. The new emperor of the state of Zhao was still young, and the royal dowager presided over the state affairs from behind the curtains. The whole world was aware that Elder He, who stood in the shadows, was the real ruler of the state. People called him 9,000 years. Though there were few chancellors like Hijan who could control the imperial court and play the emperor in the palm of his hand, they would usually die soon. Few of them could control the state affairs for so many years like Hijan. In the world of the Green Sky Mirror, Hijan was not the only one. He had another colleague, who was the Grand Secretary Zhang of the Chu Kingdom, who was called Mr. Shaoyue by the people. The Chu Emperor had been in the Cold Palace for 10 years, and had almost disappeared from the memory of the people. For many children, they only knew the Grand Scholar, but they didn't know the Emperor. The Grand Secretary Zhang was still unparalleled in governing the state affairs, but his temperament became more and more peculiar, and his methods became more and more forceful. Even though nobody dared oppose him, their resentment toward him grew more and more. One evening, after the Grand Scholar had finished reading the memorials to the throne, he felt his vision blurred. He stood up and walked to the window. Looking at the setting sun, he realized something. The previous Qin Emperor had been dead for almost 20 years. The Qin Emperor of Beihai County had been dead for 10 years, and the young Zhao Huang had been dead for 5 years. The Grand Scholar had gone to the royal palace. The news shocked the whole of the capital, and it had even spread to Zhao and the Qin kingdom. The eunuchs and palace servant girls knelt not far from the grand hall. Seeing the scene in front of them, they felt bewildered, not knowing what to do. The tightly closed palace gate was as mottled as a painting, and the iron lock was rusty. The eaves on the other side of the wall were full of traces of disrepair. Seeing this palace hall that had been abandoned for many years, the Grand Secretary Zhang had a complicated feeling. He tidied his clothes and bowed to the ground slowly. "This official asks for an audience, Your Majesty." A chilly voice came out from the palace hall. As I said, don't disturb me for no reason. For many eunuchs and palace servant girls, this was the first time they had heard the voice of the emperor. Their expressions were complicated. "This official has something to say," said the Grand Secretary Zhang. "What's the matter?" asked the chilly voice. The Grand Secretary Zhang bowed to the palace gate solemnly, saying, "This official is old and dying." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.